In early 1951, the Korean War is at a crossroads. After months of bitter fighting, the jubilation over General of the Army Douglas MacArthur's stunning victory at Incheon and the liberation of South Korea has faded into a grinding, uncertain future of war with Communist China. As General MacArthur himself admits, it is an entirely new war. The tenuous relationship between President Harry S. Truman and General MacArthur is breaking down. They have only met once and briefly, at Wake Island in October 1950, just before the start of this new phase of the war. It did nothing to prepare them for this crisis. If anything, it deepened the confusion and disagreements that fester into 1951. President Truman is a plain-spoken, pragmatic commander-in-chief, a man whose presidency has already been defined by hard decisions. He is determined to avoid World War III, and he is determined to uphold constitutional authority even in moments of crisis. Opposite him stands General MacArthur, the brilliant, bold, larger-than-life hero of 2 world wars. A commander who is ideologically incapable of accepting anything short of total victory. He now faces the moral dilemma of sending men to fight and die for a stalemate. 1 war, 2 visions. As March turns to April 1951, the divide between the president and his general sharpens. What happens when a president and a general collide? Good morning. Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial. My name is Amanda Williams, and I have the honor of being the director of the MacArthur Memorial. And I'd like to give a special welcome to our distinguished guests, Gary Bonnewell, chairman of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, Major General Joe Reness, executive director of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, General Douglas MacArthur Foundation board members, and to former ODU president and professor emeritus Jim Cook. Thank you all for being here with us today. I also want to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us from around the world virtually today. Today we mark the 75th anniversary of President Harry S. Truman's decision to relieve General MacArthur of his commands during the Korean War. Our program will examine this moment from both Truman's and MacArthur's perspectives and place it within the broader arc of American history. You will hear from scholars from the MacArthur Memorial, from Old Dominion University, and joining us for the first time, the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Today's discussion is especially meaningful as the United States reflects on 250 years as a nation and on the principles that define our democracy. Civilian control of the military is one of those core principles, a safeguard that was bequeathed to us by the founders to ensure that military power remains accountable to elected officials and to, ultimately, the American people. Like many elements of our democratic system, this concept has evolved over 250 years through crises, and it's something that continues to require constant attention and stewardship. More than 60 years ago, General MacArthur established the MacArthur Memorial as a joint endeavor between the City of Norfolk and the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, a partnership grounded in a simple principle. We are to be free and open to all peoples equally, and there are no restrictions on the MacArthur topics that can be discussed and explored here. There was great wisdom in the creation of that system and in that vision, and today's program is a direct continuation of that spirit and mandate. The General Douglas MacArthur Foundation has generously sponsored today's program, in addition to providing vital year-round support for all of the MacArthur Memorial's exhibits and programs. And so we would encourage you to join the MacArthur Committee, and it's now my pleasure to invite Gary Bonnewell, Chairman of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, to offer a welcome from the Foundation.
Well, good morning. You got to get ready and go here. We got a great program for you, and I appreciate you being here. And we're very proud to partner and host with the memorial on this, and the 6 years we've been a part of this relationship. The foundation does not exist without support, and we always need more support. So you're going to find a card in the back and on that screen on how you can be a partner with us, and I hope you'll all take this up. We've got a lot of important programming coming up as a foundation. We host a board dinner in June. We have a leadership conference in August, as well as a Joint Forces anniversary in August. And then we celebrate the victory of the World War II in September 2nd. So you'll hear more about those programs as the weeks and months go by, but I hope you'll participate, and I look forward to a great program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So some housekeeping notes. We will have time for questions after each presentation. We will have a microphone going around. So if you do have a question after a presentation, please raise your hand. For the in-person audience, for those watching virtually, please put your questions in the comments section of the live stream. Now, our first presenter is Mark Adams, Director of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Mr. Adams spent 29 years at the Truman Library and was appointed director in January 2025. During his tenure, he has transformed both the visitor experience and the library's educational programs. He was also the creator of the Truman Library's White House Decision Center, a truly incredible program that immerses students in presidential decision-making. So please join me in welcoming Mark Adams.
Good morning. Before I start, first of all, thank you, Amanda, for the invitation, and to the staff and to the board here for their support. And hopefully I'm not speaking to too much of a hostile audience as I present the Truman perspective today. I have been at the Truman Library 29 years and counting, and as Amanda mentioned, I became director January of last year. I started out as our education director and then was our museum curator. We've seen 2 museum renovations in the time I've been there. And of course, we are part of the National Archives. We're one of the presidential libraries in the National Archives system. Harry Truman actually raised the money himself to build the library and open it in 1957, just 4 years after leaving office. We have about 16 million documents in our archives on site and about 33,000 museum objects. So from those materials, I've called this presentation today. We won't be seeing all 16 million documents you'll be relieved to hear. But we do have some quite new materials related to the Korean War in general, and I'm going to scatter a few of those photographs in particular throughout the presentation today. So thank you for the invitation and the welcome. And just to say as I go through this, I don't have an Independence, Missouri accent. I'm originally from Liverpool, England, so when we get to the Q&A, if there's words that I've mispronounced or even misspelled, I have an excuse. So I don't think there's any extra U's in there today, but we'll see. But thank you for the invitation, and we're going to get started. I'm going to get my phone out here just so that I don't run out of time. I promise I won't answer any calls or texts if they all start coming in. And let's see here. So I know you know all about the Korean War. I'd like to give a little bit of context. Sometimes we have audience members that are maybe not familiar, but just the context of the Korean War. I'm not here to read the slides necessarily, but just to give you a sense of the conflict of when it began, when it ended under President Eisenhower in 1953, with the armistice that is still in place. Interestingly, just as a quick aside, that armistice agreement is actually going to be on display at the Truman Library later this month, so we're really excited to have that original armistice document on display on April 20th. For those around the world, maybe we've got some close to Kansas City that want to come see that. The museum is located in Independence, Missouri, where Truman grew up, moved there as a child, and his home that he ended up living in actually belonged to his mother-in-law until after he left office. Is just 4 blocks from the library, so it's a very Truman-centric town in Independence, but we're about 20 minutes from Kansas City, so we're kind of in the thick of that metropolitan area. You can see there where the conflict started and ended, and really this is just an excuse to show 2 of the photographs that are in our photograph collection of the helicopters and the fighter jets and so on. We have a really extensive photo collection of the Korean War, and we've even got some color photographs of Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur later on. As many of you know, with the Korean War, Harry Truman finds out while he's in Independence, he's actually at home for the weekend. He gets a phone call from Dean Acheson letting him know that the North Koreans have crossed the 38th parallel. And I don't know if that's unique or not. It's kind of just an interesting fact that he's sitting at home and he gets this phone call from Dean Acheson letting him know what's happened. And they kind of go into action right away. He doesn't leave Independence that night. He leaves Independence the next morning, but he's having phone calls, he's letting his family know what's happening, he's starting to get some reports, and then the next morning he flies from Kansas City back to Washington, D.C. to start making these decisions about what's going to happen. Very quickly, the UN Security Council brands North Korea as an aggressor. In some ways, Truman is a little fortunate. The Soviet Union at that time is refusing to participate on the Security Council because of the issue over China and then becoming a communist country in 1949. So in a way, when they do that vote, there's no veto threatened from the Soviet Union because they're vetoing themselves. They're not there. Truman authorizes US troops to become involved, not on the ground yet, but certainly to become involved. And he gives command of the United Nations troops, as you know, to MacArthur. And so MacArthur's going to be put in charge of the United Nations. Truman is a huge supporter of the United Nations, as you may well know. He really lamented the failure of the League of Nations. And actually, on April 12, 1945, when he became president, one of his very first decisions was agree to go to San Francisco for the United Nations conference that took place in June of 1945, and he gives the closing address at that conference in San Francisco. So he's a huge supporter of the United Nations, but he sees this as maybe its first test. And we'll talk some about the role of Congress here in a moment. This clicker is great, by the way. It's got a nice big green arrow, so I know which way to press. So we have this kind of infamous cabinet meeting in June 30th, and Bradley gives this summary of what's going on. He's getting the latest information. MacArthur's moved some troops from Japan is the initial move. Secretary Johnson in particular is reassuring the cabinet. There's a lot of reassurance going on in this meeting. We have the full minutes of the meeting on the Truman Library website. That all of the forces are going to be under MacArthur, although other nations are offering to help, that everything is going to come under MacArthur. And that's an important message for the cabinet to realize that there's an American general in charge. It's not going to be somebody from another nation. Other countries are beginning to offer help, and there's a lot of debate about that, about whether Chiang Kai-shek should be involved, and that materializes a bit more later on. And then we get to the key point, and one that historians debate a lot, and we could probably do a whole other program of whether Truman is going to go to Congress and get a congressional resolution to go to war. And so Senator Weary from Nebraska starts to ask that. Like, are you going to advise Congress about before putting troops in in Korea, and Truman kind of holds him off. We'll wait and see. And as we know, 75 years later, he doesn't do that. And that gets him in trouble a little bit domestically later on, which we can talk about maybe in the Q&A, with the steel crisis situation. And this not going to Congress affects that Supreme Court decision, actually. But he says, I'll come to you if it's necessary. He never does, as you know. So it comes up very early. It's not that he's not aware. We've already saw in the video, and that was a beautiful video, by the way, to set us off this morning. I was very impressed. You know, we're into the war. We're not going to go through the whole Korean War today. That's not the point of the topic. But I think it's very important to recognize the importance of the Incheon landing and how that changes the course of the war. The UN troops are cornered in the Pusan perimeter. As you very well know, in this location, MacArthur does this incredible maneuver at the Incheon landing and cuts off the North Korean troops and pushes the troops back towards the 38th parallel again. And Truman does recognize the importance of that. I think it's important to realize that although, as we'll see, they don't get along and Truman eventually relieves MacArthur of command, he does recognize his skill and his strategy, particularly in this situation. Just an excuse to show some of our photographs, but I think this is really important because this is from Incheon, aboard the USS Pickaway. Two of the medical doctors that have just removed a dum-dum bullet from a patient, from a young Marine's brain. So we know about the casualties and so forth, and we know about the MASH units, but seeing these photographs kind of remind us of the casualties and the death, and we shouldn't forget that as we look at this topic today. And this is from after the Incheon landing. And again, these photographs are from the Truman Library collection. And so these quotes might not surprise you, but I think the dates might. I think the dates might surprise you. Harry Truman and Bess Wallace Truman, the First Lady, had one daughter, Mary Margaret Truman, usually known as Margaret. She didn't use the name Mary very much. And she was born in 1924, so you can figure out her age there. He writes profusely to his wife, to his daughter, to his cousins, to many people, to many friends. We're very, very fortunate to have many of those letters in the Truman Library collection. We have more than 1,300 letters directly to Bess Wallace Truman in our archives collection. This particular quote, the first one, or both of them actually, the first one anyway, is to his daughter Margaret, where he says, "I'm not very fond of MacArthur." Look at the date on that. It's 1942, okay? This is 9 years before he relieves him of duty. So there's some preconceived material here, right, that he's saying something like that. As I mentioned, he becomes president in April of 1945. In June, what we call a longhand note. Let me explain what a longhand note is, because archivists come up with these strange terms. This is a note that he wrote himself, but it wasn't a diary. It was just loose paper. And it was his way of venting. He would write and write and write and write. And we're very fortunate that he kept all of those papers. And he does this on a myriad of subjects, on all kinds of things. Even as a county judge, county commissioner in the 1920s, he's doing this, talking about the Pendergast family, for example. So he does this a lot, but he doesn't throw them away. And in most cases, he doesn't mail them or send them to anybody. There's a few, like the Paul Hume letter, where he does mail them and gets in trouble. But in this particular case, he's only been president a couple of months, and you've seen this quote. It's in a lot of the textbooks. It's kind of one of the most well-known quotes. But what to do with Mr. Prima Donna, brass hat, 5-star MacArthur, Mac tells God, right off, and so on. Stuffed shirts like that in key positions. So pretty scathing remark. And of course, he's never met MacArthur at this point, right? And this is 1945. So we're acknowledging that Truman obviously doesn't have a very positive outlook towards MacArthur 5 years before the Korean War even begins. So I think it's important to remember the context, which is what the piece is there. And of course, this is a photograph from Wake Island, which we just saw the newsreel of. So they do go to Wake Island after the Incheon landing, and everything's pretty optimistic, right? We've broken the troops forward. We've got out of the Pusan perimeter. MacArthur's made the Incheon landing. These are two color photographs from that meeting at Wake Island, which we're going to talk about in significant length, because I think it really helps put the relief of MacArthur into context after their one and only meeting. And it's an excuse for me to show off color photographs as well. And so Truman, you can just about make out Truman there, and I believe that's MacArthur's back of his head there, but I could be wrong. But this is from Truman's recollections later, these couple of quotes. And again, most of these are fairly well known, particularly this first one. We arrived at dawn. General MacArthur was at the airport with a shirt unbuttoned, wearing a greasy ham and eggs cap that evidently hadn't been in use for 20 years. And then the second one, and this is where we get to some of the controversy. The general assured the president the victory was won in Korea, that the Chinese communists would not attack. Now, these are Truman's recollections later, and that's important to remember too. And so in that meeting, Truman asks MacArthur about the likelihood of the Chinese or Soviet intervention. When the war very first began in the summer of 1950, the State Department advisors like Dean Acheson and George Marshall, they weren't thinking of the Chinese initially. They were thinking more of the Soviet Union. And so some of that thought process continues for quite a while. But he's asking him about that. MacArthur says he knows there's thousands of troops, but he thinks it's unlikely and that the UN forces would slaughter them before they reach Seoul. And of course, we know that that's not the case. There's a very important key figure here. It's the only female that goes on the Wake Island trip. Her name's Venice Anderson. This is a great photograph of her. She was the personal assistant to the ambassador at large, Philip Jessup. And she was actually in an anteroom when Truman and MacArthur had their conversation, and she takes notes on a pad with a pencil, and then later on types those up, and they become kind of the official memorandum or the official record of the conversation. Some say that MacArthur didn't know she was there, that she was some kind of spy. She's later accused of being a communist, all of these things. We're very fortunate at the library to have her papers and her oral history, and a very significant artifact I'll show you in the next slide or two. But then some of her recollections, when asked what the chance of a Chinese or Soviet Union intervention, MacArthur replies, very little. And I mentioned she's behind kind of a half-closed door, and then she goes in afterwards, after doing shorthand notes on a pad, then goes and types these up for the official communique. A little bit more from Venice. This is the typewriter she used to make those notes, and we have the typewriter on display in our museum, so it's pretty nice to have that connection. And we have an oral history interview with her, and this is what she said. So she sat down in one of the three chairs in the small anteroom. With my secretarial training and experience, the most normal and logical thing for me to do was to record what I heard. No action. It was not intended to be without the knowledge of those present. She'd actually met MacArthur in Japan previously in her career, so they actually kind of knew each other. I think she knew him more than MacArthur recognized her. She said, I thought everyone knew I was there. I knew all the participants, members of both parties. I greeted them early and been very much in evidence just prior to the formal portion of the meeting. So there's nothing underhand. And then she talks about the conference. It was memorable. General made some surprising statements that he thought the 8th Army could be withdrawn to Japan by Christmas. And then there was this incredible statement, later very controversial, that the Chinese communists would not intervene by coming from the north across the 38th parallel. Now later on, as we know, there's some debate about what MacArthur said in that meeting, and they go back to this communique all the time. And so there's some discussion about whether that was accurate and so on. So tensions are building, right? Because of course, as we know, the Chinese do cross the Yalu River with about 300,000 troops, not the 50,000 that may have been predicted. MacArthur starts to question the way we are fighting the war. You know, a limited war is not what he wants to do. He wants to be a full war and to get victory. Truman, as we know from the video we've just seen, is wanting more of a police action, contain communism, part of the containment policy that he had launched with George Kennan and others. So they've kind of got different approaches to the conflict. Some of these statements are coming out from MacArthur, so then Truman says, no, wait a second. Anything that you say has to be cleared with the administration before it's made public. As you guys know, that's not MacArthur's style, right? So there's some certainly sense of tension there. MacArthur brings up maybe the possibility of using nuclear weapons. I think from Truman's perspective, having used those against Japan in 1945, he was very reluctant to do that. As I mentioned, he wanted a more limited war, contain the North Koreans at the 38th parallel. But he was also questioning the mindset of MacArthur already here before he relieves him of command of, you know, using nuclear weapons is certainly going to escalate to a third world war. It reminds me a little bit of the Berlin crisis in 1948, when Stalin blockades Berlin and Truman wants to rescue or save the West Berlin population of 2 million people, but he wants to do so without going to war. So he authorizes the Berlin airlift, and they're able to succeed in that matter without putting troops on the ground, but it takes a long time to do that. So his post-World War II policy is really to avoid World War III, but still contain communism. So I see those European and Pacific theater goals, he views those as quite similar. Right at the same time, on November 1st, you may not realize this, there was an assassination attempt on Truman by 2 Puerto Rican nationalists. So he's not having a very good fall. He's having a rough time all around. With the Chinese have now come in to the Korean conflict. He's actually at Blair House. He's not at the White House. The White House is under renovation at that time when one of the Secret Service security guards was killed during that attack. But Truman, thankfully, was not harmed in any way. But it kind of gives you the sense of the stress and the tension that he's feeling at that time. This is a really, really interesting interview with Charles Burton Marshall, who's in the State Department. And I wonder if many of you are familiar with this. It's quite new information, really. He talks about the Enigma program that, of course, we used in World War II, decoding messages. And we didn't reveal this for a long time, but we were decoding Spanish and Portuguese messages during the Korean War. And that revealed some information of what MacArthur was telling the Spanish and Portuguese ambassadors and representatives. And basically in those codes back to Spain and Portugal, they're talking about how he was going to make sure that the US got into a general war against China, which Truman is aware of. They let him know about these messages that are being sent to Spain and Portugal, which at the time and in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that information was unknown because it wouldn't be the best diplomatic approach to let the Spanish and Portuguese know that we were decoding their messages, amongst many other countries as well. We did the same thing in World War II. But this message from MacArthur is really telling Truman what his true aims are, and that's the last thing that Truman wants to do. So this is not why he relieves him of command, but it goes into his thinking. Of course, at the same time, we have the emergence of the leadership of Matthew Ridgway, which I won't go into full detail on, but it looks like the Eighth Army is improving, and the leadership of Ridgway is quite different, and the strategies are quite different. And now they're in a position to launch a major attack. In many ways, I think the role of Ridgway is probably often overlooked, because Truman does see a natural replacement to MacArthur if he relieves him. So that's just my point there. In mid-March, Truman is looking at some peace overtures with the North Koreans and the Chinese. He's drafting his statement. I know this is very well known. This is at the same time, 3 days later, when MacArthur issues a statement to expand the war against the Chinese. So it's kind of going the opposite of what the president's policy is. And Dean Acheson, who was a very close, I would say the two closest advisors to Truman in this issue across the whole Korean War, not just the MacArthur issue, were Dean Acheson and George Marshall, who he revered. He called George Marshall the greatest living American. But Acheson calls this an act of sabotage. Truman goes a little further, as you can see from the quote. I was ready to kick him into the North China Sea. It was in open defense of my orders. And this is an attack, if you like, to the president under the Constitution. So he's already quoting the Constitution before it really comes to a head. Then, of course, the infamous message by Joe Martin in Congress, and the quote at the end of that message, if we lose the war to communists in China, the fall in Europe is inevitable, and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. There's no substitute for victory. And of course, again, this goes against what Truman's policy is, and we've got the recap there of what Martin did, and this really is really critical of President Truman, and it's really the end game. MacArthur tells Truman, if you relieve MacArthur, you will have the biggest fight of your administration. So it's really come to the end at this point. Truman is not going to do this alone. He's going to look at his advisors and see what they have to think. But in my mind, I think a lot of it, his decision is already made. This is from his own writings. He shoots another political bomb through Joe Martin. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but some key phrases here. Looks like the last straw, rank insubordination. He goes back to the statement he made to the VFW, and he goes on about that. We told him back in December that you need to send your statements through the administration before they come out. He told me in Korea that the war was almost over, we could withdraw troops, that China's not going to come and get involved. We expect him to support our policy. So he's pretty upset, obviously. He brings in some of his closest advisors, Averell Harriman, Bradley, Marshall, Acheson. At this point, Acheson does say it's a mistake to relieve the general, as he says. Marshall says he wants to postpone the situation, kind of see what happens. Bradley says he should be fired. And Averell Harriman says he should have been fired long ago. So there's some contrasting opinions. And Truman's used to that. Just one quick example. When Truman recognizes Israel in 1948, that's probably the most divisive cabinet that he faces. And George Marshall actually opposes that decision, which really surprises him. Well, not surprises him, but he was more adamant. George Marshall was more adamant than Truman had ever seen him, and that's to really kind of calm him down and bring him around. So it's similar in nature to that, in that there's contrasting opinions. And then the Truman quote there, and I think you've probably all seen this in textbooks and so on, but it gets back to the civilian control that Amanda mentioned in the introduction. The president's commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It means the control of the armed forces are under civilians instead of military men. And he likes his history, right? So he goes back to Lincoln and Polk and other presidents who've done similar things. And he actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that he did go back and read through those historical decisions by Lincoln, particularly before he makes the decision to relieve MacArthur. He was a great student of history, even though he was the last president not to get a college degree. He was a voracious reader. So the Saturday, April 7th, he brings back in Marshall. He spells Acheson's name wrong, that's Harry Truman when he's doing handwriting. And you can see a picture of his diary here that we have in our collection. Averell Harriman, General Bradley. By now, it's the unanimous opinion of all that MacArthur is to be relieved. All four so advise. I direct the issue be ordered, press statement prepared, and suggest a meeting Monday before the cabinet meets. So he's almost there. hang on. Did I miss one? You can go back. Yeah, so that's the diary entry there. So it's done. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of how they screwed it up and the way MacArthur found out. I'm sure that the other speakers will mention that, but it really is, it was not their intent to screw it up, let's just say that. But the message doesn't get to MacArthur correctly. I believe it was through Frank Pace and others that were supposed to deliver that message. Doesn't work out the way I believe he finds out on the radio, which is terrible. Just a really misstep in communication. But I don't think there was anything deliberate there. Maybe there was. Maybe the other speakers will argue that case. Some of the reaction, and I know these might be a little bit hard to read. Of course, there's political cartoons calling for his impeachment. And these are reactions from the general public that are writing in, and they kind of vary somewhat. I'm going to move away from the microphone just for a minute because they're hard to read at this angle. But this first one from Virginia thinks the president is a traitor to his country because of the removal of MacArthur, and says, as of now, I'm a Republican, so obviously they've switched sides. Detroit, your removal of General MacArthur was necessary if we are to maintain our form of government. I applaud you. Denver, Colorado, wanted to congratulate the president on his stand and his fine talk. Gentleman, William Bailey, president, great man inspired by God, he's surprised at the reaction of wealthy people. And then from Washington, a veteran of World War II, called just after MacArthur's speech to say, Mr. Truman and Mr. Atchison are the biggest menace to national security the country has ever known. So a great variety there, I think, and there's lots and lots of these. I tried to even it out. We've got 5. I think it's maybe most of them were opposed at that time initially. That changes a little bit over time after the congressional hearings, which we're going to get to next. They are bombarded with messages, phone calls, telegrams, no emails or texts. There is a closed-door Senate hearing that basically says that he's acting within his authority, even if the decision was unpopular. It reinforces this idea of civilian control of the military. These are from some of the advisors and generals. George Marshall. It's apparent MacArthur had grown so far out of sympathy with the established policies of the United States, there was grave doubt as whether he could any longer be permitted to exercise the authority in making decisions that normal command functions would assign to a theater commander. In this situation, there was no other recourse but to relieve him. Now remember, Marshall is not afraid to oppose the president. So he could have gone a different track there, but he does support the president. Bradley, this situation involves us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. So pretty succinct. General Collins, first of all, it's quite evident to me over a period of time MacArthur was not in sympathy with the basic policies governing our operations in Korea. I felt that the president, as a commander-in-chief, was entitled to have a commander in the field, a man who was more in sympathy with the basic policies and more responsive to the will of the president as commander-in-chief. So they all keep coming back to the commander-in-chief and civilian control. With that, hopefully I've left enough time for questions. I did want to point out many of those materials, photographs, documents, are on the Truman Library website, trumanlibrary.gov. We have a YouTube channel as well, which has Truman's reflections on many of the decisions that he makes, including the relief of MacArthur. But happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir. We're going to microphone roaming.
When was the first time that MacArthur and Truman actually met? Was it Wake Island?
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Surprised me, too.
I'm passing this down the line here. My question is, you started off your presentation, which is a great one, thank you. The comment that he made about Harry Truman in 1942.
Right.
You said he did not meet MacArthur till Wake Island, which was after that.
Oh, yes.
What information, what input did he have to make that comment on?
I think he's basing that on World War II. There was some struggles during World War II that he wasn't necessarily following what FDR wanted him to do. FDR was recalling him back to Washington. He refused to come. So it was more to do with the conflicts with FDR. Truman was a huge supporter of FDR and the New Deal. And so I think anybody who kind of went against FDR at that time, Truman would have been pretty adamant about that.
Great, thank you.
Great question.
Could you comment on the ambiguities that were created by the National Security Act of 47 and 49? In World War II, on occasion, MacArthur kind of stepped out of bounds, and General Marshall, directly said, "You need to stop," and he did. This never seemed to happen in this Korean situation, and how did the roles of the chairman, the chief of staff, all of these things, the Secretary of Defense, when it was a bit ambiguous, and wasn't resolved until Goldwater Nichols.
Right.
So, any thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I think one of the things that we hindsight helps us and the research helps us. There's times where he sends Secretary Johnson to talk to MacArthur, and we don't know this necessarily at the time, but it sounds like in the history and the readings later that Johnson wasn't as forthright as Truman wanted him to be and kind of watered down the message. So as it went down the chain of command, particularly through Johnson, he doesn't really follow through with the firmness that Truman would have wanted. So I think that's where it breaks down. It's a great question. We got a couple of hands over here.
You mentioned that MacArthur didn't know about Enigma and the U.S. nuclear capabilities?
Not to the extent, no, he did not. Particularly the Enigma. He obviously knew we had atomic weapons, but he didn't know the full range of those that we had at that time. And of course, we have to remember that the Soviet Union had successfully tested their weapon before the Korean War started, so there was a great reluctance to use those. Yeah, but certainly the Enigma, he knew little about the number of countries that we were decoding messages from. It helped Truman with the decision to drop the atomic bomb in 1945. We'd broken all the Japanese codes. So that kind of military decoding of many countries was not new. We did that in World War II as well. Of even our allies, we were decoding their messages as well.
So did MacArthur know Enigma kind of existed and we were doing something like that? Or he
Right,
just
but didn't know the
didn't
breadth
know
of
it was-
countries. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I think there was a gentleman on this side.
If Truman had questions about MacArthur during the World War II, why would he put him in charge of the military at that point? Why would he pick him as commander-in-chief?
I think that MacArthur's success in Japan really helped with that decision. What he had done in Japan was groundbreaking and gives him almost legendary status the way he rebuilt Japan. Truman's trying to do the same thing through the Marshall Plan in Europe. There is kind of a Marshall Plan for Asia, but it's not as robust. But I think he saw the success there. He's already there. He's in Japan already. He has troops at his disposal. Then we're making very, very fast decisions. So I think those are the most reasons why he's willing to put MacArthur in charge. Can I say one thing about the kind of the piece with the steel crisis and the not going to Congress causes him this domestic issue? During the Korean War, as you probably know, the steel strike occurs, the steel workers go on strike. Truman seizes the steel mills because we need the steel for the war effort in Korea. Obviously, the steel mills are upset about that. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Truman is, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so I won't say them, but Truman has put many of those Supreme Court justices in place himself. So you might expect the Supreme Court to support him, but they come back and say, you did not go to Congress. He's claiming war powers for his reason to seize the steel mills. You didn't go to Congress. You don't have war powers. You went to the United Nations. And he loses that case domestically because of not going to get congressional action. So it's one of those unintended consequences of the way he administered the conflict. So I just wanted to wrap up that piece. I meant to finish that up earlier.
I
Any
have a
oth-
question.
Yeah.
In Truman's memoirs, he talks about the fact that he has always been a proponent of people in the Foreign Service, every 4 years at least spending a year back in the United States so that they can make sure that they understand the United States and its policies from inside the country, not outside the country. And he uses that to kind of
Yeah.
discuss, MacArthur's been out of the country for 14 plus
Right.
years. And do you think had MacArthur come back to the United States more, do you think if he and Truman had had more face-to-face meetings, do you think the situation would have turned out differently?
It's possible, but I would say no. I think their personalities and their goals around the conflict were so different, I think it would have been very difficult to resolve that. I think he makes a good point about coming back, and I think that would have helped MacArthur maybe have a broader outlook, but I don't personally think it would have necessarily helped their relationship, unfortunately. It's a great question. Got to wait for the mic. I'm sure it helps the people online to have the microphone.
You're exactly right, Mark. Thank you. Great presentation. As we think about the comments, I have one comment I'll give at the end, but during this time when MacArthur is successful in Japan, there's very little interaction from the State Department and actually the presidential leadership that goes to the Orient. But there's a lot of movement towards Europe, especially as they start to create the Marshall Plan there and move forward. Do you think that also led to this disconnect between the general and the president?
You could have. I think, you see as Winston Churchill would say, the Iron Curtain drawing across Europe, which he made that speech in Missouri, actually, with President Truman right next to him. The focus is on Europe. They see the Soviet expansion there as a greater threat. Of course, this is before, immediately after World War II. This is before China becomes a communist country. Truman and George Marshall are blamed for that, which I think is a little unfair. But of course, that's not till 1949. So that 45 to 49, you have the Berlin airlift crisis, 48 to 49, and we have a presidential election. We have the integration of the military. We have the recognition of Israel. As Amanda said at the outset, Truman's got a lot of other decisions to make. And I think you're right. The Cold War focus at that time is certainly in Europe rather than Asia. Whether that affected MacArthur, it probably did from what I've read, that he felt, whether that was being neglected. Things seem to be going well in Japan. China's not a threat at this point. So that explains some of that. But it may well have led to more frustration from MacArthur that it was being overlooked.
Great. I appreciate that answer. The comment is, having served for a Secretary of Defense and several theater commanders, it's interesting to see the intel that other countries that you meet with, what they respond back to their ambassadors. There were many meetings that we came out with an answer of, we gave you A, that they talked about B, C, and D. So I think that you need to put that in context, but it is a great point to look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
We very much appreciate Mark coming here from the Truman Library, as I said earlier, in a historic first between our two institutions. And you all probably have heard that terrible myth of on Wake Island, MacArthur circling in the air, waiting for Truman to land first. Obviously, that didn't happen, but I was almost late to pick him up from the airport yesterday, and I was very worried we were going to have a MacArthur, Truman. Yes, yes. So, like I said, that did not happen in history, and it didn't happen in terms of our relationship yesterday either. Our second presenter today is Jim Zobel, the MacArthur Memorial Archivist. He has been the MacArthur Memorial's lead historian since 1993, where he has managed the Gene MacArthur Research Center Library and Archives. He is recognized as a leading expert on General MacArthur and is the author of MacArthur, the Supreme Commander at War in the Pacific. And every year his work supports thousands of researchers and students. And so please join me in welcoming Jim Zobel.
If anybody has any questions about anything I say today, I've got 60 pages of source notes. Just let me know and I'll email you. Okay, it was the major event of the time, and it was in all the papers and all the media, and it was the most spectacular collision of military and civil power to ever occur in the United States. Their feud ended MacArthur's career and Truman's chance for another term as president. Was it a challenge to civil military authority? MacArthur was definitely guilty of not following the gag order, but he follows every order in the field that he cannot change through argument. D. Clayton James, MacArthur's biographer, would say that it was more a crisis of communication more than anything else. They only met once. They accepted the stereotypes of each other and the views of their confidence about their antithesis. And that was what Major General Frank Lowe said, and he was a special representative sent out to MacArthur by President Truman. He was very believed in both of these men and believed if they could have talked more that they could have worked it out. Now, Truman was facing anti-communist McCarthyism, a Republican Party that was hostile. His Secretary of State was wound up with the Alger Hiss spy trial. NATO was being created with a Eurocentric-minded Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the Secretary of State. And then MacArthur was told to fight a war, a limited war, which he never understood. War's very object was victory, not indecision, as he said. And he said he could never understand why the country didn't mobilize to win the war like they always had, whether it was North Korea, China, or Russia. He considered that he had been given a lot of leeway in how he conducted his operations in World War II, and all of a sudden there was a big clamp down on him during the Korean War, and he could never understand that. Now, they had shared experience of World War I, but they have no connection as they both live very different lives in a different circle of people. Truman is a politician who was a soldier, and MacArthur is a soldier who thinks like a politician. There is no enigmatic friendship between them like MacArthur had with FDR, and they only meet once, and that was during the Korean War. Truman called MacArthur, like we heard, Mr. Five-Star Brass Hat Prima Donna before the end of World War II. But then he does pick him to be the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and he does pick him to be his United Nations commander. They have many scrapes in the message traffic from 45 to 50, and they have a lot of problems when MacArthur is put up as a presidential candidate. But it's really the Korean War and the question of what to do about communist China that will put them to the test. Now, this isn't just a story of MacArthur and Truman, it's also the story of Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. MacArthur has a history with Marshall. They're close in age, and they were both in World War I, and then both major players in World War II. MacArthur was accused of trying to stunt Marshall's career in the 1930s, but in World War II, Marshall, as U.S. Army Chief of Staff, gave MacArthur a great deal of leeway in the prosecution of the war in the Pacific. He would try to do the same in Korea with unfortunate consequences. Secretary of State Dean Acheson does not know MacArthur, yet he can be quite acerbic in his comments about the general. They have a history of squabbling in the press since 1945 and very different ideas on foreign policy in the Pacific. Acheson is Eurocentric and one of the architects of NATO, and during his entire time as SCAP, Acheson never visits the Pacific. None of the JCS served with MacArthur except for Sherman. He had been on Nimitz's staff. He knew him because of a couple of meetings that they had together with the staffs. Bradley said in February 1950, it was the first time he'd seen MacArthur since 1922 when he was superintendent at West Point. And same with J. Lawton Collins. He was a chemistry professor at West Point when MacArthur was superintendent. That's the last time they had contact with him. They, however, like MacArthur, are for defending Chiang and Formosa as part of that island chain that keeps communist China contained. And that's what they'll talk about all that time, the littoral defense, Okinawa, South Korea, Japan, Formosa, the Philippines. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley, has been labeled as a buck-passing, sulking master of indecision in a crisis. He calls MacArthur a megalomaniac, and MacArthur calls him a farmer. We had a conversation last night. Does that mean a landlubber, or is he someone who plants bodies? JCS was fresh out of fratricidal warfare and the creation of the Defense Department, and this was when Bradley so famously said there would never be another amphibious invasion again. MacArthur thinks the amphibious invasion is the greatest tool the United States has. Now, this is a map of the Pacific region. They are all brought together, all these people in this maelstrom of war and foreign policy in Asia with the onset of the Korean War in 1950. The Cold War, NSC 68, the containment policy is in act all around, except not with China and Formosa. Now, this is Mao, Stalin, and Kim. These are the people they are up against. The Soviet detonation of a nuclear weapon in August 49, the fall of China to the communists sent a shockwave through everyone and caused a reevaluation of U.S.-Asian foreign policy. These three are all in league with the North Korean invasion of 1950. As Alan Millett said, the great Korean War historian, as long as China fought the war, they got everything they wanted from the Soviets. As long as the war goes on, the better chance that Kim Il-sung could be emperor of the rubble. Stalin will fight the Korean War down to the last North Korean and the last Chinese if he has to. And he knew that the House of Representatives had killed a $60 million appropriations bill to the South Koreans in 1950. He picks up on that, as well as all these speeches that Acheson, MacArthur, and Truman will make. They are the three greatest mass murderers of the 20th century. Throw in Hitler and Pol Pot, and you got a bunch there. Truman and his administration were managing the currents of European allies, domestic politics, and then they have to fight the war in the Korea, and it's a war where none of them really want to be, but they know they have to stand there, and they do not want to get embroiled with Mao or Stalin. MacArthur wants to destroy them all, and believes he can if he has the tools to do it. June 25, the North invades the South with tons of Soviet equipment and promises of Chinese support. Truman blames the Soviets publicly and knows he has to defend them. Omar Bradley said he was ready to go to teach the Soviets a lesson. Chinese were surprised at the rapidity of the response and the insertion of the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits, because that's going to neutralize Formosa as well as Red China from acting against each other while they're worried about Korea. Truman turns to MacArthur, the 70-year-old Supreme Commander serving in the waning days of the occupation of Japan. Truman picked an aging general, set in his ways and his opinions about war and the Far East. At the UN flag ceremony on July 14th, William Zobel, who's MacArthur's political advisor, said that MacArthur looked ashen and tired. MacArthur was chosen, and he was very gracious, and thanks to Truman, saying it was the second time he had been recognized so signally honored. The first time was when Truman made him scout. It is a desperate time, and despite being old, MacArthur faces it all with breathtaking optimism. A host of younger generals they could have used instead of MacArthur. Eisenhower in the Pentagon even says you're going to have to watch him. They were all Ike's boys, all those JCS members. All of the JCS do not know MacArthur, and all of them will be overawed by him. Now, the North Koreans invade, Walker's got to pull back to the Pusan perimeter, and this was where it becomes totally obvious of the drawdown of military forces that has happened between 1945 and 1950. In Japan, 300,000 troops have been reduced to 120,000. Of the 87,000 trigger pullers you've got there, only 27,000 of them are combat effective. Only 2 of your 12 regimental commanders had any World War II experience at all. The Marine Corps was hit the hardest. Its amphibious fleet scattered to the 4 winds. The Navy has only 1/10 of its World War II strength. And like I said, MacArthur then, as they're withdrawing, he's asking for a regimental combat team, then the 2nd Division, then the 1st Marine Division, then the Marine Air Wing, then paratroopers. The U.S. cannot do this all. Every answer is, we're going to have to wait on this. And MacArthur made the comment, when Hoover was president, I could get him off the can. Now I can't get these guys to make a decision anytime we talk. Eventually, MacArthur will ask for 5 divisions, but they will have to be, a lot of them, raised and trained. Now, Walker will defend from Osan, then to Chonan, Chowan, the Kum River, Taejon, getting into August. He consolidates the Pusan perimeter. Is an incredible effort by Walker and a general that not many had confidence in. Now, this is Charles Bolt. He is in G3 war plans back in the Defense Department. He doesn't believe in sending divisions to Korea. They are too scarce and they need them in Western Europe. So he wants to use atomics. And he sees a unique opportunity should the Chinese or the Soviets come in. They get the components of non-nuclear components for 9 bombs will be sent to Guam, 10 planes from the 9th Bomb Group. There is a 72-hour period between if they have to decide to go nuclear, MacArthur has to go to the president, and then the answer will come back. Then they have to fly the nuclear components out there. This is agreed to, and those components arrive in Guam on July 31st. Now, MacArthur is not just the one thinking of this. Everybody's thinking of it. They're all planning. The atomic bomb is one of the weapons in the U.S. arsenal, and they are all looking at it. Atomics are on everyone's mind. Now, along with Korea, MacArthur was given authority of the neutralization of Taiwan. That's when Truman threw in that 7th Fleet on the 27th. Now, everyone had different thoughts about Formosa. Acheson, the Secretary of State, is anti-Chiang. He believes that support for him drives the Red Chinese into the Soviet camp, even though they're already in the Soviet camp. In August 1949, they put out the China White Paper in the State Department that basically said the United States had no responsibility for the fall of China, which they didn't. It was the Chinese Civil War that was going on. But they also create a hands-off China Formosa problem. The Chinese will figure it out for themselves, and they have a policy of anti-intervention. Interviews and speeches by Acheson, Truman, and MacArthur put Formosa and Korea outside of that littoral defense against the continent there. And even MacArthur did not mention Formosa in 49 because they hadn't gone communist yet, but he does not mention Korea at all. Stalin's going to pick up on all of that. March 1948. That top picture up there, that's MacArthur. On the far right is Alfred Gascoigne. He's the representative from Great Britain to Japan at the time. And MacArthur was calling for aid for China before it falls in 1948 to the communists. And in a meeting with the British, Gascoigne there, he said he could take Manchuria with 1,000 airplanes and he would be the bulwark against communism in Asia. And he's also very receptive to being the military advisor for Chiang on Formosa when the occupation ends. After the fall of China, the JCS started thinking of defense and were planning to send a survey team there in December of 1949 to Formosa to figure out what the Chinese nationalists needed to defend the island, but that's when the anti-Chiang policy comes along and the hands-off policy. And the JCS was all in line with MacArthur on this strategic need of Formosa as part of this littoral defense. Now, in late July, they estimated about 200,000 Chinese were gathered in the coastline areas to invade Formosa, and there's a lot of talk of the Chinese going to invade. Special advisor to Chiang, Admiral Charles Cook, is forwarding photos of planes in Shanghai, the Chinese lengthening airfields, and this causes a lot of worry. And in late July, the Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson, wants a survey of Chinese national abilities, and JCS gives MacArthur the clearance to head up a survey team. MacArthur goes to visit Chiang July 31st through August 1st, and this freaks out Truman and Atchison. What is he doing there? You know, we're trying to keep Formosa out of this mix so that the Chinese don't think that we're, you know, going against them. Try to keep them away from that Soviets. And then on August 4th, the State Department rep on Formosa tells them that MacArthur is going to base fighter squadrons there. It wasn't true. MacArthur was going to do familiarization flights over that part, but that Truman needs to talk. And so he sends Averell Harriman out there. That's the guy in the second part. And MacArthur knew Harriman, knew the Harriman family from back to his parents' time. Now, Harriman comes out there and he says, look, don't talk about Formosa. We're trying to keep this off the table. And MacArthur says, I don't agree. We should back Chiang, but I'll keep my mouth shut. And then MacArthur sends a message to the Secretary of Defense. He says, I'm not going to exceed my authority. I know what's going on. You know, the meeting, he says, he knows the Reds are the dominant force, not the Soviets. That's what he tells Harriman at that time. Harriman doesn't trust MacArthur and knows that for Chiang to retake China, he needs the U.S. in a war with China. That's why they're really worried about MacArthur talking with Chiang at this point. Now, the VFW message, MacArthur had told him that nothing would go out or he wouldn't say anymore, and then he releases this note to the VFW convention that's going to happen in Chicago, basically saying that Formosa is an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine pen. If the Chinese communists get it, they will have an inroads to us. It'll send us all the way back to the West Coast. You know, totally just going against what he had told Harriman he wouldn't talk about. And he also says that, you know, he doesn't believe in the appeasers who will not, and says that if we defend Formosa, that will not alienate Asia. Now, Frank Lowe, that's that guy who was the liaison sent out there by Truman, and he comes out there with Harriman. He read the VFW message, thought there was no problem with it, but it causes a big flack with the European allies as well, because they're like, what is the policy going on here? And Truman orders him to relieve it. Now, on the 25th of August, Warren Austin, who is the UN representative there, he has to go and declare exactly what the United States policy is on China because of this. Truman thought he needed to fire MacArthur right then. They'll say this many times, the JCS, Truman, Atchison, he should have been fired right then. They never do, as we know. Now, the day before that VFW message went out, the JCS came to MacArthur to talk about Incheon. They were all against it. They wanted to go lower down at Kunsan. They got into the conference where MacArthur did this spectacular speech about why they had to go into Incheon. You know, the seconds of hands of destiny are taking all of this, and they still don't agree with it, but they don't tell him no. And then it all goes in, and they're all cowed for it. They follow the man with the plan. All of it works. 7 days before the invasion went off, they sent him a message questioning everything about the invasion, and MacArthur sent him a reply, you know, look, it's going to work. This is the reason it's going to work, and it did. And that's going to silence all the critics right there. And as well, Truman had backed MacArthur the whole time, and that gamble paid off because now everybody's flush with victory, and they all want to keep it going. They're all ginned up on that victory. Collins, back in the Defense Department, is calling MacArthur the sorcerer of Incheon. General John Michaelis, the great paratrooper of World War II, said, when you get a man of strength and character, people become afraid of him, and he doesn't get the full picture. And this can be said of the JCS and MacArthur. All were proven wrong. They had all been against it. It silences all the critics. Perhaps they were right later on looking at it, of going in at Kunsan lower down, but now everyone is flush with victory. But the problem is there's no checks and balances on MacArthur now. There's no Halsey there. There's no Nimitz there to tell him that all your amphibious plans for going up north are ridiculous. And even Ridgway says MacArthur could cause the opposition to melt and doubters to doubt themselves. And I think that's what this whole thing shows, that we don't understand this, you know, aura, this magnetism that this guy had that could be able to make, you know, grown men feel like children in his presence. And that's what they said. It was like the adult talking to the kids sometimes. Now, Warren Austin, that's over him on the left. now everybody was for crossing the 38th parallel. This is another thing that people said it was all MacArthur. Austin addressed the UN about it on August 18th when Collins and Vandenberg, the Air Force Joint Chiefs of Staff, went out there in early July. They said that the 38th parallel will be no problem. And even with the same with the JCS when they had just come a few weeks before in August, they had said it will not be a factor. The only person who thought that, or people that thought it was going to be a problem were George Kennan and Paul Neitz, two of the guys who were behind the NSC 68, the containment policy. They said if you go up north, you're going to bring in the Chinese. Now, Nehru and the British want to just stop it right there at the 38th parallel. They want to offer the Chinese a seat in the UN. They want to calm this situation down. Let's get this thing over with. That's probably what they should have done, is ended it right there. But everybody else is all geared up, and they get the General Assembly to vote to go north. October 7th resolution, which is based on NSC 81-1, which was for the invasion of North Korea, where they're going to unify the country, hold free elections, and end the communist drive there. Now, at the end of September, right before they go, George C. Marshall sends MacArthur a message that says, we want you to feel unhampered strategically and tactically to do what you need to do. Probably the wrong thing to say to Douglas MacArthur. And as well, 28th of September, Kim Il-sung asked Stalin for help. And Stalin says, you have to ask Mao. And October 2nd, Kim appeals to Mao. That's Ni Rongzhen on the far right over there. He met with the ambassador Panikkar from India and told him, so we lose a few million men checking the Americans. Who really cares? And then Zhou Enlai uses Panikkar as well to tell the Allies that if they cross that border, the Chinese are coming in. They make the cross. Of course, the Truman Wake Island Conference, like we talked about before, a lot of people said it was just about publicity. MacArthur never said that. At least in his memoirs, he would say he didn't want to be dragged across the Pacific to have a publicity stunt done on him. And Truman does bring an extra plane load of reporters with him. Now, he arrives the night before, so like you said, Amanda said, there's no dramatic confrontation. And Truman said he asked 3 times about the Chinese coming in. There was about 30 questions in 90 minutes at the meeting, one item after the other. Dean Rusk sent Truman a message, said, let's slow down, let's talk about these things. And Truman said, no, I want to get out of here. And this is what it was. MacArthur said it would be the greatest slaughter if the Chinese came in due to his air power. No one there says you won't be able to bomb the Yalu bridges and you won't be able to bomb the Chinese bases in Manchuria. And he also said later that it was speculative, but we do have the very Vernice Anderson's appraisal of that. They will all remember this and they will all hold it to him like he tricked them or something. He thought it was over, they all thought it was over, but a new enemy was about to come into the war undeclared, like Pearl Harbor. The main thing about it was that as soon as the meeting was over, they said, let's have lunch. And MacArthur said, no, I'm going back to Tokyo. And that was extremely rude and crass, even though Bradley said MacArthur couldn't have been friendlier at the meeting. Now, Walker's moving in October. MacArthur's going on this other amphibious move to Wonsan up there on the top right. Walker was very much against this. All the Navy people were very much against this. It was pretty much a cluster. And they don't get ashore until the 26th. 2 weeks are wasted. Some have said that the JCS and the Secretary of State took their eyes off Korea. They thought it was over at this point, and they were looking back at the creation of NATO, and no one counters that Wonsan fiasco. The JCS have no plans. They are following MacArthur. They think he's going to clear this all up. They all think it's over with. On 19 October, Peng Dehuai moved the 13th Army Chinese group into North Korea opposite the 8th Army on the left side. The next day, Walton Walker's men moved into Pyongyang, which was the capital of North Korea. And then on 24 October, MacArthur removed all the restrictions on non-Koreans going to the border. This was very much precise of the UN resolution. And he just does it, and then Bradley comes back and says, what are you doing? Why are you removing this? And basically, Jeffrey Perret said MacArthur was discarding the strategy designed not to widen the war and changed it to one that was courting it. like I said, Bradley came back. What's going on? And MacArthur says he can't trust the Koreans. I'm carrying out the campaign. I thought I was to feel unhampered strategically and tactically. Oh, boy, does that irk the JCS right there. And he also says that he had discussed this with the president at Wake, but Bradley doesn't know what they discussed in private. And the thing is Truman was banking on MacArthur's ability. And on that day where he changes the resolution, Truman sends him a message of support and about his great generalship in this campaign. And the JCS do nothing. They're walking in the footsteps of giants, supposedly. 23 October, Pak Sun-yup's 15th Regiment picked up a Chinese POW, 1st Corps Commander Shrimp Milburn, saw him, sent the word to G2 in Tokyo under General Willoughby. He discounts it. Willoughby had one of the largest intelligence apparatus in the Far East. Nationalist Chinese sources closed down in 1950, and he was using the Joint Intelligence Center from Washington as well as the CIA reports. None of them pick up on any Chinese activity. They say not in 1950. And as well, he discounts information about Chinese activity. Percy Thompson, who was the 1st Corps intelligence officer, said he thinks there are 2 divisions in front of him, and 8th Army intelligence discounts that as well. And then on Alman, on the 29th, on the East Coast over at Wonton, up near Hungnam, sees Chinese that they've captured there as well. The JCS says it seems to be overt Chinese interference. MacArthur on 3 November gives them a message that he is perplexed as to it, but then the Chinese withdraw. He's filled with caution and reassurance, but he could not support the idea of going back to the narrow waist of Korea. He thought that there was no reason to do that at that point. November 4th, even Dean Rusk, who's the Joint Policy Planning Staff, he's saying maybe we should use nukes to bomb the Chinese concentrations. General Earl Partridge of the 5th Air Force, he wants to bomb Senwiju up on the Yalu River and as well firebomb Kangdi as to get this thing over with. And then MacArthur orders the bridges over the Yalu destroyed. Stratemeyer sends this as a message to Vandenberg in the United States, and then he shows that to Atchison. They cut off that right there. The JCS and Washington consensus is to move back to the waist of Korea and consolidate the 8th Army and the 10th Corps. But that's when the Chinese disappear. And MacArthur says he has to bomb these bridges, that he faces destruction if they do it. They go to the president. President Truman says that they can bomb the southern half of the bridges, do not violate airspace over Manchuria. And then on 7 November, MacArthur said men and material are hurrying over the Yalu River. And then Bradley comes back to him, this is hysterical. This is mostly, extremely different from your November 3rd when you were given this assurance. And MacArthur says, look, they've moved a corps or more over the Yalu. I mean, one day he's saying he faces destruction, but the next day Stratemeyer says he can wipe out all those Chinese concentrations with conventional bombing. And MacArthur the next day says, okay, I'm going to wait a couple of weeks and then I'm going. Nobody stops him. Now, Max said he had to move to figure them out. He said, I've given you everything I know. They're here. They've taken the initiative in the West. They'll keep augmenting if we don't do anything to them. I'm going to bomb them and move forward. A reconnaissance in force. He should have stuck with that explanation. And then Marshall sends him, why are the Chinese doing this? Is it the hydroelectric dams? And MacArthur goes on a history lesson of why the Chinese are now on the move. They'll move into French Indochina. They'll move into Tibet. Eventually, they will move to all these different places. Marshall comes back and says, I don't think you understood my question. And I don't think he understood MacArthur's answer. Now, MacArthur will bomb all these areas, and the thing is that the British are saying, let's pull back, and when MacArthur says he's not going to bomb, he pretty much lays into them, says they're a bunch of appeasers, and this is going to, the Allies are going to just be fully against MacArthur with this, and so Truman now is going to have to be starting to deal with that. On 24 November, MacArthur does his massive compression envelope. That's what I mean. He had said recon and force before, but now he's going for this massive compression envelope to end the war. Now, in the first few weeks before this, William Zobel, his political advisor, said he was optimistic. He was unfazed at the prospect of Chinese or the Soviets in a general war with both. It's all very matter of fact. If it happens, so be it. 17 November, he was with Ambassador Muccio in South Korea, and he said that he was sure that Stratemeyer could destroy the bridges and forestall the deployment in North Korea. No one is saying anything from the JCS, yet all feel something's wrong. Major General J.H. Burns in the Office of Secretary of Defense says we have to send a team out there to talk to him about a new mission, but that is disregarded. O. Edmund Chubb of the State Department, he says the Chinese are going to come in force, but nothing is done about that either. 24 November, MacArthur starts the drive, and he believes that anything less than destruction of all enemy forces is a tribute to lawlessness and aggression. When he returns to Japan, he puts out these communiques that pretty much lets the Chinese know they have not been detected. The Chinese come in force. They surprise with the 13th and the 9th Army groups, about 350,000 Chinese. They hit the 8th Army as well as the 10th Corps there. And MacArthur sends the message to an entirely new war. We've done everything humanly possible. We need a new policy at this point. And MacArthur's message is totally despondent, and even his wife said this is when the first time he ever stopped sleeping, and his hands start shaking with stress. It's an overwhelming victory for the Chinese. It guarantees that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North will last for decades. The Wall Street Journal, however, will say both groups of superiors wanted to keep him shoved out on a limb so that they could blame him for whatever happened. It would never do to let the world hold our government or the United Nations responsible for their common liability to decide what they are trying to accomplish in the Orient. Truman will feel like he was lied to at Wake. He threw all his chips behind MacArthur, and now he feels cheated. It was war. It was a completely new force, but all of his fury is focused on MacArthur, who assured him it would not happen. Like the European allies, he does not blame the Chinese. He blames MacArthur. What lost confidence? This is Harriman. Or this is Dean Acheson. What lost confidence of the Allies was MacArthur's costly defeat. He pressed his luck and will to a shattering defeat. Harriman would say he brought us to humiliating defeat. And Marshall would say, get out with honor. No war with China, as that is what Russia wants. Like I said, the Chinese came in unannounced, and everybody holds MacArthur because they all followed him and would never correct anything that he had to say. It was a mauling. Was it worse than the Battle of the Bulge? No, but there was no patent to rectify the situation. 11,000 U.S. casualties, 6,300 from the 2nd Division alone, and now everyone wants out of Korea except Mao, Kim, and MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had said in his memoirs that Walker had prepared plans to move out, but they were so mauled that everything's in flux. The Marines put on an amazing display of willpower to get out. Army units fought to destruction next on the other side of the Chosin River or reservoir against superior forces, defying their ability to attack the Marines. And the JCS says move to the waist and consolidate the 8th and the 10th Corps there. And MacArthur says that's impractical, and that tips Bradley with anger right there. But even Major General Lowe had said, because he had flown over it many times, that it was a joke to think that that terrain between the narrow waist was defensible. Europeans blame MacArthur and not the Chinese. And de Gaulle said they were castigating the very man who was fighting their battles for them, a foreign military leader whose daring was feared by those who profited from it. MacArthur asked for Chinese nationalists. Washington says you will have to handle it. There's no more reinforcements coming. And even J. Lawton Collins said Korea is not worth a nickel. Why did they get involved there in the first place? November 30th, now Collins is thinking about delivering an atomic ultimatum to the Chinese, and that's got to be on Truman's mind, because on November 30th, he makes the blunder of, in a press conference, talking about nuclear weapons, and that it had always been a weapon that was on the table, and that their commander would have discretion, over this, and totally gets it mixed up. Then Clement Attlee from Britain comes there. He says, let's get the Chinese to the table. Let's offer them the UN seat. We'll give them Formosa if we have to. And Truman says they can't do that. They can't abandon the South. If a ceasefire is proposed, we would give up nothing. December 4th, Collins comes out. There's a grim MacArthur waiting for him. MacArthur gives him a memo, says that no, if reinforcements, we have to evacuate. If reinforcements, we can hold in successive positions. Collins came with General Charles Zobel, a major proponent of nuclear weapons. MacArthur told him he could stabilize the poor situation and says postpone any decision on nuclear weapons until he has a timetable for evacuation. He does want commander's discretion because of that 72-hour leeway period. If the Soviets, had launched some kind of air attack on Japan, it'll all be over before the 72 hours comes. Now, even later in the month when he's talking about being attacked by the Chinese, he did not raise that question of the nuclear option. He saw it as the ultimate fallback if they were being forced out of Korea. MacArthur does propose sowing radioactive waste so that the Chinese can't get across it, and everyone freaks out about that today, but the JCS had actually brought that up meetings, and Senator Al Gore Sr. Had brought that up before the Senate in conference. Now, Collins, when he goes to Korea, he meets with Walker and he meets with Allman, 10th Corps, 8th Army Command. He doesn't see the disaster. These guys say they can hold out, and the thing is, MacArthur's G3, Pinky Wright goes there, says the same thing, but when he comes back to see MacArthur, he does not bring it up, that he thinks that the Americans could hold. Why not? And this goes back to what James said. It's a crisis of communication. MacArthur gives him a map to leave with, and it's the 9 lines of withdrawal, and he tells him we need a new policy. And then MacArthur goes to the press. Everybody was hammering him about the Chinese. He's portrayed as a blundering warmonger with his forces fleeing in panic. And this is what George Marshall says is the heart of problem with MacArthur and those in Washington. He went public with all these things where he never did that in World War II. The massive compression envelopment that he talked about went back to being that reconnaissance in force, and this causes a lot of more of anger coming at the press from him. The drive, he said, had sprung the Chinese trap, that nothing could be more of a fabrication. David Lawrence interview, inability to hit the Chinese bases was a limitation unprecedented in military history, probably. Arthur Kroc, the decision by the Chinese communist leaders to wage war was long premeditated. That was true as well. Hugh Biley, the issue is a global one, failed to comprehend that this fact carries the germs of freedom and ultimate destruction. Ward Price, it was a war long premeditated. All these statements that they give, and that's what brings on the gag order from Truman. He's tired of it, and so they say that you have to say everything to the Secretary of the Army first. Now, in comes again our guy Charles Bolt, December 21st. They're worried about war with the Soviets, nuclear war, and so he's asking all the services, if the Soviets come in and this goes nuclear, what are the sites we'll bomb? MacArthur sends him the 26 list. This is what's used by everybody to say that MacArthur just wanted to nuke everything. He was asked to send this list of sites. Now, Collins had sent a blessing of his leadership on the 15th. There you go again. I mean, they're all very worried about him, but they still are very, saying, oh, we are totally behind you. He still has the support of JCS and Truman, but now they are in control and they want to get out. Why did they get in the first place? Raised at West Point on the U.S. grant strategy of mass and concentration. He does not understand this or the sensibilities of Washington, which is worried about a Soviet thrust at Europe. They are worried about a nuclear war, as shown by Bolt's request. MacArthur can't understand why no full mobilization to counter the threat like the United States has always done in the past. The UN is weakening. The Europeans are appeasing the Chinese. They invite the Chinese representatives to come and address them. Zhou Enlai says, withdraw from Korea, and the Chinese give us a seat in the UN, give us Taiwan, and we are going to unite the peninsula by force. You've eradicated the 38th parallel. And then on December 29th, the new policy is given, and it says defend in successive lines, and then you choose when to evacuate. And that's, like I said, putting MacArthur with the Wall Street Journal, putting him out on a limb, and MacArthur just thinks this is Bataan all over again. Truman will send him a letter that says, we understand what you're up against, but this is what we're trying to do. We have to let the Soviets know it's all this psychological points of what they have to do, why they have to be there. There's no incentive to win it. And that's what MacArthur can't understand. He said we should use Chiang's forces. We should invade the south of China, at least throw guerrillas in there. He wants to bomb Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, hit the interior of China, and never an expansion of the land war or sending troops into Manchuria, though. The JCS always say this is under consideration, while at the same time they say no, 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 no. December 23rd, 8th Army Commander Walt Walker's killed in a vehicle accident. Matthew Ridgway comes in, well-known, trusted, and liked by MacArthur. At their first meeting, Ridgway says this guy knows how to analyze a situation and be able to tell you exactly what he's thinking. And after the meeting, Ridgway radios back to Washington, we should use the Chinese nationalist troops. He gets there right as the Hungnam evacuation happens. 10th Corps gets pulled back into South Korea. They save the 10th Corps at that point. And then December 31st is the Chinese third offensive. They have to let go of Seoul. Now, 6 January, this is just a couple of weeks after getting there, Ridgway asked that all the chemical weapons in the zone of interior in the United States be sent to Korea. He's worried about a Dunkirk. He's going to use anything he can. At this point, MacArthur says that's not going to happen. MacArthur has his own ideas about chemical weapons because of World War I. Doesn't even send it to Washington at that point. But this shows what Ridgway's thinking. Then on 10 January, MacArthur sent those ideas about, bombing the coast or blockading the coast, bombing China, and everything. Acheson and the people in Washington think MacArthur is preaching doom to get what he wants. Do they know that Ridgway has just asked him for chemical weapons? Truman sends him a personal message. Like I said, the next week, Collins comes and visit, and he goes to see Ridgway. And Ridgway says, don't worry, we're here to stay. We're going to smoke them. Nothing about what had happened before. And Collins had just been in Tokyo where MacArthur is telling him, we have to evacuate. There is no way that we're going to hold on to this thing. And so does he actually tell him that? Now, MacArthur knows he has changed his mind and told Collins a completely different story, at this point over there. And it makes MacArthur look like he's totally devoid from the reality of the situation, still preaching evacuation. Ridgway comes in, gets the army going. They're not beaten. By January 15th, he's on his first offensive. He'll go on 4 offensives. And by March, he's back up at the parallel, have done all this by himself. MacArthur said, 8th Army is yours. Handle it as you will. MacArthur, this is where he really starts testing that gag order. He will give all these sorts of statements in February and March of 1951. I think the main reason is on 22 January, the Christian Science Monitor had come out with a statement. This was right after Collins had left him in Tokyo, and it said that the JCS is now bypassing MacArthur. They're dealing only with Ridgway. MacArthur was a supranational, supra authority over them before. They're not going that way anymore. Now they have things under control by going underneath MacArthur's radar. And that's got to send MacArthur through the roof. And that's when all these statements, testing that gag order, we're in a die for tie. He doesn't exactly say that, but that's the initial response of this message that he's putting out. And they keep saying, hey, you're violating the gag order. Never that's it, you're violating the gag order. It will come to that, but not as of yet. Now, February 23rd, MacArthur's still saying throw the nationalist Chinese into the South. He's still trying to win the war. And his Joint Staff Planning Operations Group had actually put together a plan of all the lift they would need to get 100,000 Chinese nationalists onto the Chinese continent. By late March, Ridgway is back at the 38th parallel. He's over the 38th parallel. He's done what MacArthur said couldn't be done. MacArthur said you had to bomb all those places, you had to blockade the coast, you had to do all these things, or else you would have to evacuate. Ridgway proved that he could do with what they had there and go back to the 38th parallel. And MacArthur sends him a message right when he gets there. It says, don't go beyond the 38th parallel. Don't get involved in any big mess up there right now. That goes to him in late March. But that's when, as we talked about before, the 24 March statement comes out. With the return of the border, Washington and the Allies wanted a peace conference. They wanted status quo antebellum, and MacArthur squashed it with this statement. And he said, basically, the Chinese generals, you've been destroyed in the field. Do not make us unleash on China proper. Your strength has been exaggerated. And MacArthur would later say he learned that the peace conference was going to give them a UN seat. And he said, you can't reward belligerents with a seat in the UN. And this is what sends the Allies absolutely ballistic. What is the policy? You know, we thought we had ended this part about the Chinese, or about policy in Korea at this point, and that's when Truman knows that he's finally got to get rid of him. Ridgway said he had cut the ground from under the president and enraged our allies, and he made it so the Chinese couldn't accept that peace feeler without a severe loss of face. And then the Joe Martin letter. Joe Martin's probably the most rabid anti-Truman Republican there is. MacArthur sent in this letter, yes, of course we have to use Chinese nationalists, and that's when Truman says, okay, he's politicizing the war now, siding with the Republicans, and that's when he finally says, he had said he had never violated things like that before, he didn't want to get rid of the man in the field, he was going to go with him all the way through, but this was him getting into politics, and that's when he knows he's going to get rid of him. The final trip to Korea, once again, they believe the Soviets had moved a great deal of air power into the region. They're talking about nukes, and on March 10th, MacArthur says, I needed D-Day authority in case that happens. Again, that 72-hour, because it could be over all before then. And he and Ridgway are actually planning Operation Avalanche. That's for a complete evacuation in case they have to nuke the whole peninsula. And Truman, on 6 April, ordered all the SAC bombers to Okinawa. They have all the conferences about MacArthur's relief. Harriman is for it from the start. He said you cannot trust him. Then Atchison, Bradley, and Marshall on the 7th agreed to it. Bradley said he was a prima donna figurehead that had to be tolerated. Why? He could have done anything he wanted earlier. No, he didn't. No, he did not. None of you had the courage to do anything. That's what Bradley said. They always said he followed every order and that it wasn't insubordination. He didn't follow the gag order. He was not having sympathy with the policy of the conflict. He failed to clear statements and difficult having him plan for eventualities. And he said that the military must be subordinated to the civil, and they were concerned. And this is something that was never vocalized to MacArthur. We're concerned that you're violating the civil-military relationship. MacArthur could never understand why the country could not make the resolution to mobilize the country. To not carry through what was started was the same as defeat in his mind, and it would only embolden the communists, and especially the communist Chinese. Dean Rusk said it was a fear of what might happen when they're talking about all these atomics. The Spanish and the Portuguese ambassador, they had been looking at these breaks in the code as well. These two men are Salazar and Franco that run Portugal and Spain. They are the best friends of MacArthur's intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby. And a lot of people have wondered, was it really Willoughby that they were talking to at this point? Because there's a lot of goofy stuff in those transcripts that don't really make any sense. MacArthur, it's been said, was an inconvenient reminder of a Korea policy that hit a rock, and they were all behind him until the going got difficult, and then his aggressiveness was a liability. Starting over with Ridgway was a Korean break from an embarrassing past. Washington committed itself to maintaining a world. If there were no more wars among great powers, there would certainly never be peace. Undersecretary of the Army Frank Pace was supposed to tell MacArthur, but they feared the Chicago Tribune was going to break the story, so they announced it at 1 in the morning. Did MacArthur know he was going to be fired? He had gone to Ned Alman on the 9th of April and said that he didn't think he'd see him again. He had become politically involved. Frank Lowe, that general who was the liaison, was fired right before that. MacArthur picked up on that. And then as well, Pace, who was the Undersecretary of the Army, had been with MacArthur a couple days before and voiced that Truman was very upset about not only the 24 letter, but as well the 5 April letter that was read by Joe Martin. Truman's statement, he relieved him of command, fire, whatever you want to say. Truman let him go. He said in the statement that he wasn't in line with American policy. Like I said, the JCS said he followed every rule in the order. He just violated that gag order. But also Truman said on his own, the order of relief, General MacArthur's place in history as one of our greatest commanders is fully established. The nation owes him a debt of gratitude for the distinguished and acceptable service he has rendered this country in posts of great responsibility. It's something probably that Truman knew he didn't want to write, but he was trying to appease a lot of those Republicans who were going to go crazy on him in a couple of weeks. Now, Ridgway visited him right before he left. He said he was in total control, upbeat, his usual self. Said he couldn't conceive of no possible reason why Truman had fired him. And General Courtney Whitney, who's MacArthur's main confidant at this point, he tells the press as well that General MacArthur has no understanding of why he was fired. And when Truman read that, he laughed and said, well, everybody else knows why. Of course, the press went nuts. This is everything they love. But the people didn't really know what had happened. All that behind-the-scenes intensity wasn't known to them, and it was going to play out to them in real time. MacArthur leaves Japan. He was invited to speak to Congress. He talks to Herbert Hoover. It's the only guy he's going to take advice from. If you look at what Hoover told him, MacArthur's speech to Congress is pretty much follows that line of what Hoover said. Hoover said, you got to come back home, start a moral crusade in the United States. People have fallen away from what they need to know. Now, were the MacArthurs planning on doing something else? I don't know, but Crawford Sams, who was MacArthur's genius doctor who ran the public health and welfare section in Japan, said that MacArthur told him, I don't believe that the American people will permit their sons to be killed if they know that they are being killed senselessly under such a no-win directive. And I think he was planning on coming home and striking while the iron was hot. Why did MacArthur push it with Truman and them? He would say many things afterward. He was very bitter, but he would always come back to that fear of the fall of Western civilization to Chinese and Soviet communism, always with his selective memories, telling himself he could have stopped it. His time of decision and position was over. April 16th, he flew out of Japan, stripped of his commands, but left with grace and dignity. Hawaii, San Francisco, and then Washington, where all the JCS are at the airport to meet him. The address to Congress, MacArthur lays out what he thought. There's no cry of revolt. There seemed to be no challenge. I'll just fade away. Speech, he tucked off a lot of the firebrands who wanted him to come back and just that, some kind of revolt. Of course, it would be another year and a half before he faded away after a dozen or more speeches on Korea and his, the administration. MacArthur will blame Marshall for the affair, even more than Truman. He said Marshall should have talked to everybody and told them what MacArthur was like and that, he wasn't out of his mind. But here he is with Marshall at the ceremony, right after the address to Congress. And that's what I mean. They're going to have these hearings right after. Does MacArthur think because they showed up at the airport, as well as Marshall being there to see him, that the JCS are in line with him? MacArthur will have the parade, 7 million people. Everybody goes crazy for the next year and a half. They were really coming to see the hero of World War II. Now, those hearings start in May, and Marshall said it in the hearings. MacArthur went public. That was the problem. Bradley announced the entire Washington position in the Senate hearings. Wrong where, wrong place, wrong time. He said, Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Should I read that again? He says U.S. forces would have been absorbed in China. MacArthur never advocated that. It is all suppositions in their heads about what they thought he would do. And once again, it comes back to James. Was it a crisis of communication? Even the hearings said in there that they noticed the timidity of the JCS when communicating ideas to MacArthur. All information bleeds out in the forum. It's redacted and printed daily. It shows that we as a nation were totally unready to fight the Soviets, played out right before him. Vandenberg said it was a shoestring air force. Sherman was the only one that said they could have probably blockaded China, but that was about it. But most of all, the hearings made the people realize the JCS was not in league with MacArthur, and that's when the fervor died. Both were exiled from positions of power. At baseball games, that's the arena of the public, and Truman goes to the baseball, he gets booed. MacArthur goes there, and there's all the hecklers. Hey, Mac, how's Harry Truman? Truman in the polls was so bad that he didn't even run in 52. MacArthur's campaign to get the people behind his ideas lost its momentum after the hearings. MacArthur had no groundswell against Taft at the 52 convention. or again in the campaign, and it was obvious at the convention that MacArthur spoke at that Eisenhower would be the candidate. Truman's objective was the containment of communism, not the usurpation of China or Soviets. Like Ridgway said, MacArthur was violating the gag order. The president had the right to relieve whoever they want. MacArthur advocated war against those that were belligerents against him. He advocated moves against Red China that were all rejected, and he accepted them. MacArthur, in reminiscence, said the legal authority of a president to relieve a field commander, irrespective of the wisdom or stupidity of the action, has never been questioned by anyone. The supremacy of the civil power of the military is fundamental, and that was not an issue in this case. Neither could ever let it go. They fought in the press, 1956, Time Life, TV appearances. Even after MacArthur dies, Truman told that ridiculous story about Wake Island and Merle Miller. That was what happened with Marshall and Admiral King in World War II. They had that fight over who was going to land first. Did they revert to the ideas of MacArthur after June of 1951 with the advent of peace talks, right after Van Fleet had crushed the final Chinese offensive? There were no options other than stalemate or expanding the war. Eisenhower comes in 52, and planning on eventualities, he will threaten the bomb. But really, it's not until Stalin dies that it's over, because the Soviets said they weren't going to supply the Chinese with any more that they could get. Chinese had the third largest air force at the end of the war, all the facilities to repair them, factories to build arms. And MacArthur said in reminiscences, China became the military colossus of the East. Korea was ravished and destroyed. 3/5 of the casualties were after he left. Indochina and Tibet were next. Mao's clash with India, communist insurgency in Malaya, all the things that MacArthur had forecast in his November 8th message to Marshall. It keeps going back to that. Who was right? South Korea is a free and independent country. There was no Soviet invasion of Europe as was feared. Truman is the one we always want to be right. Here's that map from 1950. Hey, look, it's the same as today. North and South Korea, China and Taiwan, Japan, the littoral defense. Nothing has changed geopolitically or strategically since MacArthur was fired in 1951. I talked to the Japanese chief of staff of their Navy a couple of years ago, and that's all he talked about. As long as we can hold these islands, this littoral defense will be okay. MacArthur in 1960 wrote a letter to General Ziereth. He said, the great tragedy of all this is that our political leaders lost their courage when, with our control of the air and the seas, our virtual monopoly of the atomic bomb, and with 500,000 fresh troops offered by Chiang, we could have destroyed China's capability of waging modern war, ensured her pacifism for a century to come. Pinky Wright, MacArthur's G3, said MacArthur, this course of action probably would have worked. And many others agreed to that and still do. But like MacArthur said at Wake Island, that is all speculative. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We've got a few minutes for questions.
Jim, question here. It seems like MacArthur's problems really started when the Chinese intervened and started pushing 8th Army and 10th Corps back. Your thoughts on how, from a military perspective, he could have committed such a basic error of allowing 8th Army and 10th Corps to be in positions where they could not support each other? Because clearly after Ridgway took over, it was not a problem with their fighting capabilities.
Yeah, that's what all of them say. You know, how could that have happened? You can only say they all thought it was over. You know, they thought this thing was going to end. I think right at the end, MacArthur does have an idea that the Chinese are coming in. That's why he does that October 24th resolution to change the policy. Syngman Rhee had gotten in touch with him a couple of days before and said that I've got things to talk to you about what's going on up north, but he doesn't see it. Now, there is that mountain range, the Taebaek mountain range, it's right in between them. You can't really unite them at that point. Further south, yes, you can. You know, that waste of Korea, that was the same thing, the problem right there. But yeah, they're widely dispersed. I think MacArthur gets hammered a great deal because he, says that right before they're going, it's a massive compression envelopment, and then it comes to, our reconnaissance and force. But that's what he had said in the message traffic. You know, I need to figure out what they're doing, but he missed it all. You know, He doesn't see the Chinese in. The Chinese were very good at what they were doing. They had destroyed Chiang because they became excellent night fighters. They have nothing bogging them down. They have no trucks. They have no artillery. They have no heavy equipment coming out. It's just men that are hiding in railroad tunnels during the day, and you can't see them when they're traveling at night. And MacArthur would always say it sprung the trap. That's not true at all. The Chinese were making an attack, and they were fully aware of what they were doing, and they hit them exactly when they wanted to. So that's the big question. But it's a undeclared war. They came in unannounced, and he was responsible. That's what they all say.
When MacArthur kept violating the gag order, at any point in time in those sequence of violation of that, did he think he might get fired, or was he?
Well, that's what Ridgway's talking about. And when MacArthur issues these things, that guy Lowe's looking at them all, and he doesn't see any problem with them. And MacArthur always says, "I'm supporting the president in this." But you can see it's kind of trying to change policy. We have to do something else, and Truman had figured this out. But they never call him on it. Now, does he think that it's coming? Ridgway said he never saw it coming. It was the way it was done because it was, released at 1 a.m. How crass, they couldn't even bring me back for a conference or anything like that. But it's more the way it's done than that surprises MacArthur, I think, than anything else. There are other people that say he knew he was courting them, that he was trying to, court them to fire him. But it's like, I have no idea why I was fired. I mean, of course you do.
Jim, I know that the general is kind of tagged with the intelligence failure of not understanding the Chinese were there and then losing contact with them. But wasn't that more of a national intelligence failure than just scat?
Well, that's what he says, and that's what Willoughby says. The problem is, and that's what Alan Millett, if you read his books, he says that Willoughby had this really great intelligence apparatus, and especially using the Chinese nationalists, but their sources clamped down kind of after Incheon, and they weren't getting that intel from them. Willoughby's looking at Washington for intel at that point. He's got his intel guys on the field, but he's looking to Washington for that intel, and they don't know. And, like I said, the CIA report says they won't interfere in 1950. So, they all blame MacArthur, but they were all in on it. And they were all worried about what was happening, but they don't say anything because it's MacArthur. And they're all waiting for him to pull the rabbit out of the hat again. And that's what O.P. Smith said, that right before the Chinese came in, he was very worried about it, but he was like, MacArthur's going to pull the rabbit out of the hat again. And that's what they all looked for. And that's what they all wanted, and they all followed him to that gate.
We have a question from online. Given the media's positive shift in focus on MacArthur after the firing, and considering that organized crime influenced many newspapers at the time, do you think he was receiving their help to burnish his image or distract from other issues?
Well, I think it was more that they didn't know what was going on. It's like I said, all this intensity is all behind the scenes. It's not really playing out from them. So it was like, they've just gone back to the 38th parallel. We've equaled this thing out again. And then he fires him. Hey, what's going on? And because they had not seen MacArthur in 14 years, he comes back. There's the big fervor. All the World War II generals and admirals all came back at big parades. This is the first time MacArthur. So everybody's going insane over that. But it's those hearings when they finally realized that all this intensity behind the scenes was going on and know the JCS wasn't in concert with him, even though they weren't telling him that all the time, that's what causes the people. And the momentum switches back to Truman, after that.
You said that MacArthur was opposed to the use of chemical weapons due to his experience in World War I. How did he feel about the U.S. use of biological weapons developed by the Japanese unit?
Yeah, I think he considered them the same thing. basically at that point, and knew that nobody back in Washington was going to go for either one of those. Though Washington had been talking about transferring nuclear components, things like that, to the Pacific, there was nobody had really said anything about that. They had talked about the radioactive waste, like I said, but pretty much World War I kind of got everybody, because of the use of gas and things like that.
Jim, a couple of years ago, you found a very interesting telegram in the archives from Truman to MacArthur. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was many people that always tried to get a rapprochement between the two. Leif Sverdrup, who was a friend of Truman's as well as MacArthur's, he had been MacArthur's aircraft engineer in World War II, and tried to do it many times, but it never happened. And then, MacArthur started making statements later in life that Truman had guts, he liked him, because he had taken on MacArthur, he'd kicked him out, didn't have any qualms about doing that. And Truman, when MacArthur's on his deathbed, Truman sends him a telegram and says, I hope you get better. I don't wish this on anyone. It's a very gracious thing to do. So, I mean, and it was something that nobody had ever printed before. We found it in the condolence files, which is about 80 boxes that few people have ever looked through. And so we found that piece, yeah.
All right, last question.
Good morning. Thank you for the great presentation. I was just wondering, what do you think the best biography of General Douglas MacArthur is?
Well, there's about 250 books on MacArthur. D. Clayton James wrote 3 volumes on MacArthur. It's very unbiased. He slams MacArthur where he deserves it, and he gives him a lot of credit where he deserves it. It's out of print now. American Caesar is probably the best known. If you put American Caesar right next to D. Clayton James's 3 volumes of MacArthur, he paraphrases about 100 pages in a row. I mean, they should have sued him for plagiarism at that point. But there's a lot of great books that are better for, like, MacArthur and World War I. Fraser Hunt is pretty good because Hunt was there with them at that point. And his superintendent, there's a book by a guy named Gannot that was with him when he was superintendent of West Point. So that's a real good one. Sidney Hufford was his aide. He has some really good insights about MacArthur from World War II through Korea, the personal side. So, I mean, there's a lot of great, biographies that all deal with various aspects of his career. But, like with anybody, to even get some kind of early understanding of someone, you got to read at least like 5, 6 books about a person. Right. Thanks, y'all. All right. Glad it's over.
All right, we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll return for our final presentation of the day. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. All right. So welcome back. Our final presenter today is Dr. Timothy Orr, Associate Professor of History at Old Dominion University. He is the co-author of the national bestseller, Never Call Me a Hero, a legendary American dive bomber pilot remembers the Battle of Midway. And he's currently working on a new book project about a U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot in the Pacific War. Dr. Orr's focus is American military history, and like our first two presenters, he plays an important role in supporting and teaching students throughout the year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Orr.
Thank you very much for having me. So in 1962, writer Merle Miller conducted a series of oral history interviews with former President Harry Truman that were eventually published in a 1973 biography, long after Truman and MacArthur had died. During these interviews, Truman spoke about his controversial decision to sack General MacArthur in April 1951. Truman's explanation is pithy, and it is worth reading aloud. Now, to preface, a few scholars have suggested that this particular passage might have been fabricated, because in fact, Merle Miller is the source for this apocryphal story of the two men circling Wake Island, waiting for each other to land, and that's why people have questioned it. But I do find this particular quote in line with Truman's brash style of conversation, and in line with his contemporaneous reasons for firing MacArthur. So upon being asked, Truman said this: "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. That's the answer to that. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the laws for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail. I've given it a lot of thought, and I've finally decided that there were times when he wasn't right in the head, and there was never anyone around to keep him in line. He didn't have anyone on his staff who wasn't an ass kisser," unquote. Now, for my own opinion, I think President Truman was incorrect on a few points. First of all, MacArthur was not a dumb SOB. Second of all, although America has produced a great number of generals who were dumb SOBs, to say that 3/4 of them met that criteria seems excessive. Third of all, MacArthur was a fairly clear-headed fellow. And fourth of all, although his staff did have its share of shameless admirers, they were not by any means all that way. But it is that first thing that Truman said, upon which I would like to focus. When asked about his reason for the firing, Truman laid it out in one sentence. He wouldn't respect the authority of the president. It is a well-known fixture of American military history to say that one of its hallmarks is that it runs on the principle of civilian control of the military. So for Truman to make the accusation that MacArthur would not respect the authority of the president implies that MacArthur had committed a mortal sin that runs contrary to the essence of the American military establishment. Now, my primary objective today is not to tell you whether or not I believe that MacArthur committed that sin, though I will share my opinion on that nonetheless. It is instead my objective to argue that MacArthur sits at the end of a long line of confrontations between civil and military authorities. MacArthur was hardly the first general to be accused of disrespecting a president's powers as commander-in-chief. By comparison, the words he uttered were far less inflammatory than those of his predecessors, far less troublesome to the sitting president, and far less likely to lead to a military coup. But those words from 1951 were sufficiently problematic to be considered over the line for acceptable behavior. And I contend that this was the result of 175 years of persistent conflict between American presidents and their senior generals over which of the two had the right to make the key command decisions that shaped the path of history. It might be said then that MacArthur was not so much a victim of his own ego, or even the victim of the ego of Harry Truman, but the victim of history itself. Now, Americans' distrust of their own military did not arise as a phenomenon unique to democracy. Instead, it was inherited from British politics, a capstone concept offered by the Whigs, the political party that opposed absolutist monarchy. During the years of the colonial crisis, British Americans drank in the ideas of radical pamphleteers, Thomas Gordon, John Trenchard, Algernon Sidney, and a host of other names that are now forgotten by the average American. And they came to the conclusion that standing armies were antithetical to the notions of liberty. Now, for example, Oliver Noble, a minister from Newburyport, Massachusetts, who had access to these Whiggish pamphlets, used what he learned from them to foment rebellion in the colony. On March the 5th, 1775, the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, Noble delivered a harangue from his pulpit, chiding the sentiments of all wise men, the patriots of every country, the experience of all ages bear testimony against a standing army as inconsistent with liberty. Whenever there exists a power in the free state to trample upon or control its laws, that state is no longer free. It does not strain much imagination to imagine that some of the men who were attending his sermon perhaps fought the British a month later at Lexington and Concord. Now, of course, the great irony of the Revolution was that in order to outlast the British, the Continental Congress required a standing army of its own, a substantial force that needed to be fed, uniformed, outfitted, equipped, provisioned, and paid. Throughout the conflict, the Continental Army and the general public were at odds with each other. The Continental Congress lacked the ability to enforce taxation, and it could do little to control the inflation of its own currency. It appealed then to the state governments, but they responded only by looking after their own financial interests. Unwilling to make sacrifices on behalf of those who were fighting, the state governments let the Continental Army nearly starve to death. As a result, George Washington and his officer corps became openly resentful of civilian governments for not making the sacrifices necessary to sustain the army in the field. The situation became so strained that, in March 1782, as the Revolutionary War finally neared its conclusion, the Continental Army's officer corps staged a near coup d'etat, a scheme to march on the national capital, acquire post-war pensions through brute force, and possibly install a military dictator in place of the newly created Confederation Congress. Known today as the Newburgh Conspiracy, this plan was foiled in embryo by George Washington himself, who advised his officers to lay aside their grievances by asserting that the pride of having fought well should be reward enough. Washington's words are often quoted, But less attention has been paid to the language of the Newburgh grievances, which well encapsulated the disgust that soldiers felt against civilians for quite literally leaving them out in the cold. Can you, read the grievances, then consent to be the only sufferers by this revolution, and retiring from the field, grow old in poverty, wretchedness, and contempt? Can you consent to wade through the vile mire of dependency and owe the miserable remnant of that life to charity, which has hitherto been spent in honor? If you can, go, and carry with you the jest of Tories and the scorn of Whigs, the ridicule, and what is worse, the pity of the world. Go starve and be forgotten. But if your spirit should revolt at this, if you have sense enough to discover, and spirit enough to oppose tyranny under whatever garb it may assume, whether it be the plain coat of republicanism or the splendid robe of royalty, if you have yet learned to discriminate between a people and a cause, between men and principles, awake, attend to your situation and redress yourselves. If the present moment be lost, every future effort is in vain, and your threats then will be as empty as your entreaties now. Now, from this tension arose America's need to put constraints on its standing army. Upon drafting the Constitution, the framers made certain that all service personnel would swear an oath of allegiance, a vow to preserve, protect, and defend the country and its government, with practice as well as words. That oath requires all uniformed personnel, from the lowest private to the highest general, to accept the fundamental principle of civilian control of the military. Now, since the ratification of the Constitution, that principle has been put to the test. Early on, generals clashed with civilian authority due to ambitions that arose from threats to their reputation. Brigadier General James Wilkinson, who you can see on the slide here, was Thomas Jefferson's senior general, and he became the first serious problem. In 1806, General Wilkinson had gone to Louisiana Territory to assist in the quashing of the Burr conspiracy, a plot that was crafted by none other than the former Vice President Aaron Burr to manufacture a war with Spain that might cause Louisiana to secede from the United States. Now, Wilkinson's operations prevented war and they prevented secession, but in the course of carrying out his duties, he declared martial law over the refusal of the territorial governor, seemingly to arrest witnesses who might have testified to the general's early complicity in the very conspiracy he was sent out to quash. These moves displeased Jefferson, and they enraged Congressman John Randolph, the other image you can see on the slide, who interpreted Wilkinson's moves as abuse of power. During the subsequent trial for the Burr conspirators, Randolph, who was acting as prosecutor, kept Wilkinson on the witness stand for 4 days in a vain attempt to get the general to perjure himself. Randolph declared, "I would teach the military that they are to be subordinate to the civil power, and that if they are to undertake to violate the civil institutions of their country, they should pay the penalty of their lives. If you do not guard the people from such an excess of military power, the time will come when you will be kicked out at the point of the bayonet." Now, it was not always generals who took counsel of their ambition, but presidents as well. 40 years later, during the Mexican-American War, President James K. Polk became fearful when one of his generals, Zachary Taylor, won too many victories in northern Mexico. General Taylor was a Whig and Polk was a Democrat, and the president feared, and rightfully so, that Taylor would use his military fame for a presidential bid in 1848. To prevent Taylor from making any further advance into Mexico and winning additional glory, Polk reassigned 4 of Taylor's divisions to a different general, hoping that the reduction in troop numbers would convince him to stay put. The move, by the way, nearly spelled disaster for the U.S. Army because the Mexican Army made an unpredictable 200-mile march north across the desert to engage Taylor's forces at the Battle of Buena Vista. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, the Americans won the day. Now, the most serious confrontation between a president and his generals happened during the American Civil War. When that confrontation broke out, West Point-trained generals often found themselves at cross purposes to Abraham Lincoln's administration. West Pointers, who tended to belong to the Democratic Party, approached the war in a conservative manner. They advised tactics that focused on entrenching and maneuverability. They wanted to limit the war's destructiveness and to prevent Confederate territory from being reorganized and Confederate leaders prosecuted for treason. Also, they wanted Union victory to restore the Union to status quo antebellum, the Union as it was, with slavery left untouched. Meanwhile, Lincoln and his cabinet thought the exact opposite. They believed that U.S. generals needed to be more aggressive, to attack the enemy more relentlessly. They believed that Confederate civilians needed to feel the burdens of the war by having their property confiscated, their borders remade, and their citizenship imperiled. And most importantly, by 1862, they believed that the war effort needed to include emancipation. Reunion could not occur until the Confederate rebellion accepted the extinction of slavery. Union generals, particularly those from West Point, struggled to subordinate their training to the political wishes with which they disagreed. Colonel Eugene Causley, pictured here, claimed that the generals in his division all planned to resign if the president or Congress enacted emancipation. Causley claimed that he would do the same. He wrote, "If Congress, the president, or their fanatical abolitionist generals will institute measures for the emancipation of the slaves against the wishes of the majority, then I will myself withdraw from the field. I came here to reestablish the Union as it was, but not to robe and subjugate any people. Let the South be paid as they deserve for their folly. Let every man die who works to destroy this land of liberty, but never steal their property, as the abolitionists desire to do with the Southern men." Not every general could endure the policy of emancipation, and some did indeed tender their resignation. Some left the Army gracefully, but many others did not, and they had to be forced out by the Lincoln administration because of their resistance to emancipation. One of the most illustrative cases involved Colonel Frank Wolford, you can see here, commander of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry. In March 1864, his men gifted him a new presentation sword. In the acceptance speech, Wolford openly criticized the president's policy of recruiting black men into the Union Army. He delivered several other speeches criticizing the government until 3 months later when a Republican general ordered Wolford arrested for delivering seditious remarks. Now, before a court-martial could be convened, Lincoln stepped in, offering to release Wolford from arrest and award him with an honorable discharge, but only if Wolford promised not to say or do anything that might hinder the recruitment of African-American troops in the future. Upon being offered this deal, Wolford lost his cool. He fired off an angry letter that accused the president of being a tyrant, of holding him in confinement to score political points to ensure his reelection, and declaring his willingness to die on a gibbet before accepting the legality of his arrest. In a prediction that did not hold true, Wolford said this: "Impartial history, in attesting the goodness and severity of God, will write you down as the greatest tyrant that ever lived." Now, Wolford's anger was a bit abnormal, but he was hardly the only U.S. officer to use his rank to advance his political aims. Throughout the war, Union officers used their positions to foment political interference, and both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, engaged in this type of behavior. In one instance, in November 1862, Major General Carl Schurz, a Republican, admonished President Lincoln for appointing too many Democrats to the rank of general. Problematically, most West Point trained officers were Democrats, but Schurz believed that it would be better for the Union to have untrained officers than generals who disregarded the president's will to enforce emancipation. Schurz wrote, "If West Point cannot do the business, let West Point fail. Who cares? It is better that 1,000 generals should fall than that the Republic should be jeopardized a single moment." Lincoln, by the way, did not heed Schurz's advice, and he replied to him by saying that he would continue to appoint capable officers even if they came from the rival political party. Perhaps more startling, Union generals put pressure on their own troops to vote the way they wanted. The Civil War was something of a revolutionary moment for voting because it was the first time in American history that hundreds of thousands of Americans voted from afar, having their ballots or the results of their in-camp elections mailed home to be included in the local polls. In 1864, a Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh arrived at the Army of the Potomac's encampment to distribute Republican ballots to the soldiers. A Democratic officer, Colonel Jacob Schweitzer, became so incensed at the minister's success that he challenged him to a fistfight, vowing to, quote, thrash the life out of him for his unpatriotic utterances of those belonging to the Democratic faith. In August 1864, a soldier in the 179th New York, a Democrat, wrote an inflammatory letter to his local newspaper, encouraging voters on the home front to vote against the Lincoln government in the upcoming presidential election. That same letter, by happenstance, criticized the Army of the Potomac's commander, George Meade, calling him, quote, the most complete military charlatan that has ever worn a major general's stars. Meade, furious upon learning what the letter had said, insisted upon a court-martial, even charging the defendant with the 57th Article of War, which, if found guilty, would have resulted in the death penalty. Now, happily for the soldier in question, Private Newton Spencer, the court found him not guilty of the capital crime. But it did find him guilty of lesser offenses, forcing him to forfeit 6 months of pay. But he was returned to active duty. The controversy did not end there, however, because a Republican general who owed his commission to Lincoln's good graces appealed to the War Department to overturn the verdict. But after months of correspondence, Lincoln refused to intervene. Newspaper reporters, too, could become victims, and they faced humiliating treatment when they earned the ire of generals. The very same officer whom Private Spencer had insulted, Major General Meade, became livid when a Cincinnati reporter embedded in the Army, a man named Edward Cropsey, whom Meade intentionally called Crapsey, affronted Meade's incompetence in an editorial published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Losing his temper, Meade refused to give Cropsey any additional access to the Army of the Potomac's bivouac. Meade ordered Cropsey mounted backwards on a mule and forced him to wear a placard that read, "Libeler of the Press," before having an armed guard parade him through the camp so that thousands of Union soldiers could jeer at him. But beyond silencing the media, attempting to control elections, threatening dissenters, flouting presidential authority, and attempting to delay the promotion of other officers, some Union generals indulged in the most sinister of all anti-democratic ideas, replacing the office of the president with a military dictator. Now, the character who indulged these fantasies the most was Major General George McClellan, the vainglorious first commander of the Army of the Potomac. His feud with President Lincoln has become legendary among Civil War enthusiasts, and his desire to suggest a dictatorship is made fully evident in his private letters to his wife, in which he held contempt for the civilians who directed the Army and Navy. Writing to his wife, McClellan groused, "I cannot tell you how disgusted I am becoming with these wretched politicians. They are a most despicable set of men, and I think Secretary of State Seward is the meanest of them all, a meddling, officious, incompetent little puppy. He has done more than any other one man to bring all this misery upon the country, and is one of the least competent to get us out of the scrape. The President is nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. Secretary of the Navy Wells is weaker than the most garrulous old woman you were ever annoyed by." And then, as if to add this, as if he needed to tell his wife this, "Only keep these complimentary opinions to yourself, or you may get me into premature trouble." Now, McClellan spoke of dictatorship in these letters to his wife, apparently driven by his derisive attitude towards the administration, but also by his own high opinion of himself. But he also mentioned that if the opportunity came, he would turn down the dictatorship, or rather claimed he would relinquish the dictatorship when the war ended. This is what that particular letter said. "I will never accept the presidency, but I will cheerfully take the dictatorship and agree to lay down my life when my country is saved. I am not spoiled by my unexpected and new position. I feel sure that God will give me strength and wisdom to preserve this great nation." Now, Lincoln knew about these dictatorship rumors, as did a great many generals who supported him. Lincoln never confronted McClellan about it, but he did famously chide another Army commander, Major General Joseph Hooker, who seemed to have the same idea in his head. Before appointing Hooker to Army command in January 1863, Lincoln put him on notice. "I have heard," Lincoln wrote, in such a way as to believe it, "of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." Now, this is a funny line, very typical for Lincoln's style of comedy, but what then followed was a more serious admonition, one that explained to Hooker why such complaints about the government and about previous Army commanders would, in the long term, hinder the war effort. Lincoln continued, "The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse the Army of the habit of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it." Now, it is no surprise then that in the aftermath of the Civil War, prejudice against professional generals persevered. The behaviors of the anti-Lincoln generals had been so aggravating, even borderline seditious, that the U.S. government sought to restrict their influence in public life. In the post-Civil War years, the Commandant of Cadets of West Point, Colonel Emory Upton, drew heavy fire from politicians merely because he dared to suggest that the United States should spend its fortune on developing a standing army and rely less and less upon citizen soldiers, the U.S. volunteers, and the state militia. When Upton attempted to publish a book on that subject in 1874, Illinois Senator John A. Logan campaigned to suppress Upton's writing, accusing him of aspiring to create an anti-democratic military elite. This underlying fear of a standing army lasted into the interwar years. For instance, Colonel John Macaulay Palmer testified before Congress during the hearings that were meant to create the National Defense Act of 1920. Palmer, who was a dyed-in-the-wool West Pointer, advised a peacetime army to be made of citizen soldiers. He declared, "If American citizen armies, extemporized after the outbreak of war, could do as well as Washington's Continentals and as well as the citizen armies of Grant and Lee, what might they do if organized and trained in times of peace?" Now, the answer to Palmer's rhetorical question was obvious to those who sympathized with his opinion. Professional armies, if left to their own devices, would cause mischief for American democracy. And there was no shortage of generals or admirals who caused mischief. Too often, they refused advice from politicians if they did not mesh with their worldview. Franklin Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy as well as Commander-in-Chief, hated the continued resistance he faced from admirals who opposed his effort to modernize the fleet. In 1940, Roosevelt wrote to a friend. He said, "The admirals are really something to cope with, and I should know. To change anything in the Navy is like punching a feather bed. You punch it with your right hand, and you punch it with your left hand until you are finally exhausted, and then you find the damn bed just as it was before you started punching." Now, some of these disputes could be exhausting. In 1925, the nation was captivated by the saga of the court-martial of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, Deputy Chief of the U.S. Army Air Service. For years, Mitchell had been demanding the creation of a separate, independent Air Force, and to make his case, he had been interfering in Navy ordnance tests to prove that airplanes could sink battleships. Eventually, Mitchell published his findings, which included privileged information, in a controversial book entitled Winged Defense. And to top it off, he made wild accusations accusing certain admirals of treason due to their mismanagement of the Navy's aviation branch. An emotionally unstable man, Mitchell demanded his day in court, and the U.S. Army obliged him by charging him with the 96 Article of War, that is, acting prejudicial to good order. After a 7-week trial that called 41 witnesses, the court found Mitchell guilty as charged. Mitchell's peers could see his posturing for what it was, a narcissistic attempt to create an independent command for himself. And as an aside, it should be noted that one of the major generals who sat on that court that found Mitchell guilty was Major General Douglas MacArthur. Now, the Second World War changed all of this. More than any other conflict, that war altered America's public consciousness about the dangers of having a standing army and navy. The need to develop a multinational alliance that engaged in coalition warfare required American generals to become much more involved in social and political affairs. Senior generals and the president's chiefs of staff ended up creating foreign policy, and their decisions vitally shaped the contours of post-war reconstruction in Europe and Asia. Now, as the nation geared up to fight the Cold War, or potentially a third world war against the Soviet Empire, American generals and admirals sat at the pinnacle of international esteem. They had become men almost universally credited with restoring the world order. And that leads us to the Truman-MacArthur controversy, when the decision to relieve MacArthur of his duties turned on the question of whether his behavior had violated the sacred principle of civilian control. MacArthur called for air attacks on China, which Truman rejected. When Truman denied his request, MacArthur went to the public, implying that Truman was practicing appeasement. MacArthur didn't speak directly to the American people. Instead, he wrote a letter to the congressional minority leader, a Republican, Joseph W. Martin, who's now been pictured 3 times today. Hopefully you walk away with what memory of what he looks like. In turn, Martin read a portion of MacArthur's letter on the floor of Congress. Scathingly, that letter criticized Truman's policy. It said, "If we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. Win it, and Europe most probably would avoid war and preserve freedom. As you point out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory." Now, from Truman's perspective, MacArthur's letter to Congressman Martin constituted the breach of protocol that obligated him to relieve the general of his command. Truman ordered his removal, and on April the 11th, 1951, he addressed the nation. And this is what the president said. "We do not want to see the war in Korea extended. We are trying to prevent a world war, not start one. The best way to do that is to make it plain that we and the other free countries will continue to resist attack. But you may ask, why can't we take other steps to punish the aggressor? Why don't we bomb Manchuria and China itself? Why don't we assist Chinese nationalist troops to land on the mainland of China? If we were to do these things, we would be running a very grave risk of starting a general war. If that were to happen, we would have brought about the exact situation we are trying to prevent. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real aim of our policy. It was with deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is far more important than any individual." Now, trust, in my opinion, is supposed to go both ways. But it would seem that in this case, the trust was one-sided. Truman was willing to trust MacArthur's competence as a general, but MacArthur was unwilling to trust the president's right to forge a new policy. Although MacArthur accepted his firing gracefully, I would contend that he left military service without rancor or contempt. In his final message to Congress, delivered on April the 19th, MacArthur made it abundantly clear that he did not support Truman's right to negotiate a peaceful end to the war in Korea. He said this, "Efforts have been made to distort my position. It has been said, in effect, that I was a warmonger. Nothing could be further from the truth. I know war as few other men now living know it, and nothing to me is more revolting. I have long advocated its complete abolition, as its very destructiveness on both friend and foe has rendered it useless as a means of settling international disputes. But the utter destructiveness of war now blots out this alternative. We've had our last chance. If we will not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door." Now, whatever else might be said about MacArthur, I think we need to recognize the sincerity of these words. War in the 20th century had grown more ferocious, more all-encompassing, and more high stakes, to the point that MacArthur could not, in good conscience, remain silent when a president with whom he disagreed put the nation on a perceived path to ruin. But as much as we might sympathize with the humanity of MacArthur, we must also recognize the fact that he violated a cardinal rule. He did not accept the president's right to be wrong. MacArthur often said there is no substitute for victory. I respectfully disagree. In a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, the voters of these United States and the people they place into power always have the right to substitute whatever political resolution they desire, no matter how incorrect it may be, no matter how it may affect the lives of the men and women who serve our nation's armed forces, and no matter how many lives it may cost. For right or wrong, that is the principle upon which civilian control of the military stands. If those decisions end up treating the armed forces unjustly, then the shame should fall squarely upon the voters for selecting incompetent people to serve as commanders-in-chief. Now, in 2002, Dr. Richard H. Cohn, now professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina, wrote an essay in which he lamented the increasing efforts of senior generals to frustrate civilian authority. Now, at the time, he was speaking directly to those generals who had treated the Bill Clinton administration with contempt. Cohn used his essay as an opportunity to remind them about their obligations to respect their civilian leaders. Now, a portion of his essay is worth quoting because it could easily be applied to the story of General MacArthur. Cohn said this: "Ponder whether you are prepared to accept, as a principle of civilian control, that it includes the right of civilians to be wrong, to make mistakes, indeed to insist on making mistakes. This may be hard to accept, given that people's lives or the security of the nation hang in the balance. But remember that the military can be wrong, dead wrong about military affairs. After all, you are not politicians. And as Karl von Clausewitz wrote long ago, war is an extension of politics. If the trend toward increasing friction and hostility in civil-military relations continues into the future, the national security of the United States will not be well served." Now, when we look back upon the legacy of the relief of General MacArthur, now 75 years removed, we should remember it as a bittersweet moment. A strong case can be made that MacArthur was right. Given the persistent international problems and human rights violations caused by the North Korean regime, even to this very day, there can be little doubt that MacArthur's insistence on prosecuting the Korean War to unconditional victory would have led to long-term benefits in both the United States and Asia. But given America's checkered history between its presidents and its generals, particularly in the 19th century, where it was the worst of all, we must also conclude that Truman did the correct thing by relieving MacArthur, because surrendering even an iota of civilian authority would strike at the very heart of our national character. In short, if you take away nothing else from my presentation, know this: Harry Truman might very well have been the real dumb SOB, but Douglas MacArthur was still duty-bound to respect him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Orr. We have some time for questions, and we have another microphone going around. It's a lot of information to wrap your mind around, isn't it? 3 tour de force performances and presentations. Ryan.
In line with MacArthur's actions, could you comment on, in World War II, when General Marshall, Admiral King, and General Arnold all opposed President Roosevelt's insistence on invading North Africa, and they put in writing their opposition to that and sent him a direct letter in writing saying, "We are opposing your policy." And of course, Roosevelt writes back, "You're going to do it," and he signed it the only time commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
So could you just comment on your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on it is I think that Roosevelt probably sympathized with those generals and admirals because the American plan was always to open up a second front in Western Europe, right, in a cross-channel attack in northern France. But I think their hands were tied because in order to do that, they needed the requisite amphibious assault equipment coming from the other allies, particularly Great Britain, and Britain did not want to do that. They wanted to fight in the Mediterranean, and they were pushing the Americans towards North Africa. And there's a really great quote from Eisenhower where he says, you know, you have to understand this international alliance from multiple perspectives, right? And this is we, the Americans, we fight this war based on our own predispositions, right? And for the Americans, it is you got to go into Western Europe first because the last thing you want is to let the Soviet Union come in and liberate Western Europe because then it's all going to go communist and everyone in America is going to freak out about that. But the British, their perspective is they want to hold on to empire. right? So they're doing whatever they can to make sure the Allied offensives are first directed into places where the Tories in Great Britain can walk away with a political victory. So my answer to that is, I would imagine that Roosevelt was sympathetic to what those officers were saying, but in the end, he had other obligations, which is to secure this international alliance, to make sure that Britain and the United States worked in lockstep, because for the early part of that alliance, it was not. So I think that's why he stepped in, and I was unaware of how he signed it, but I imagine that the message was sent, right? We're commander-in-chief. I have bigger problems than your kind of myopic ideas about military strategy. This is about creating an international alliance that may, in the end, be necessary to fight off a third world war against the Soviet Union.
I know this is going to muddy the waters a little bit. See if I can make this clear. The civilian authority, with the president being the commander-in-chief, and the Congress, coming to Congress to declare war, muddies the water a little bit about the civilian authority. Can you touch on that? I know that there will be more questions on that in other programs, but it's confusing to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think this was part of the both the successes and the failures of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, right? That you have these 55 delegates who are coming in trying to define what controls there should be over a standing army, right? And, by the 1780s, a lot of the leading members of government in the United States kind of changed their tune on standing armies, right? Because they discovered that there were problems when the United States becomes a nation, right? There is a thing called the Algerian hostage crisis, where American mariners are taken hostage by the Barbary states, and they can't ransom these guys back. There are continued problems against the Shawnee and the Miami out on the frontier, and they can't put down these wars against Native Americans. So they're starting to say, all right, maybe the biggest event of all is called Shays Rebellion, which is a local rebellion, that there is no army available initially to go up to Massachusetts and stop what is essentially a coup d'etat by the working class, right? So for all these reasons, now the people who are putting together the U.S. Constitution say there needs to be a standing army, but there's got to be some power to keep it in check. And they put in all those powers into Congress, right? So Congress decides the shape of these armies and navies, how big it is, where they can deploy, and most important, whether a state of war exists. And so the immediate check that the people have upon the armed forces is mostly going to be through the Congress. But then the president is, of course, the person who directs where they go and decides what they do, right? And it's a very interesting separation of powers, right? So it essentially gives the president very vague instructions about his or her role as commander-in-chief. Because that Article 2 says president is commander-in-chief. It doesn't say anything more than that. You can interpret it as wide as you want, right? But then the congressional powers are delineated and they're very specific, right? And so I think the idea behind it was, number one, to give the president freedom to be basically the senior chief of all armed forces personnel, but at the same time there is this easy way that you can hold those powers in check, right? Because there are congressional elections every 2 years. If you don't like what the president's doing, put in a new set of congresspersons, and if the president is doing military actions, you can just give that president an army of one person, right? And they won't be able to do anything about it. And the other aspect is kind of the human aspect, which is, as the framers were putting together the Constitution, they spent all their time on Article 1 creating the legislature. And then when they got to the presidency, they were all worn out because they were in a room with no air conditioning, smelling each other's BO. So If you look at Article 2, it's much shorter, and when they get to Article 3, the Supreme Court is even shorter than that, right? So they just wanted out of there, and the powers of each successive branch of government became more and more vague, right? So I think that kind of explains the interesting dynamic. But so far, 250 years, it's been working for us, right?
So MacArthur is someone that was very concerned about the military-industrial complex, and Eisenhower is very concerned about that later too. Does that add another element to this kind of back and forth between the military and then the political leadership?
I would imagine it does, right? That there is kind of the concern that generals are, I don't know, calling the shots when it comes to the types of American industries that develop. I have to plead ignorance. I'm not so much an expert on this era of history as I would like to be. But I mean, there were some pretty kind of rough encounters. One that I know fairly well is called the Revolt of the Admirals, which was kind of mentioned briefly by one of the other speakers. So in 1949, there was this effort to by the newly created U.S. Air Force to try to take all aviation, right, and bring it under their own branch of service. So they want to steal the Navy's aircraft carriers, they want to steal the Marine air units, and then the Air Force will control everything that is in flight. And it ends up leading to cancellation of a few important Navy ships, including this big super carrier they're going to create called the USS United States, to build this intercontinental bomber, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. And just how these contracts are awarded leads to congressional hearings. The admirals kind of argue that this one branch of service, the Air Force, is calling the shots too often, right? And and they find it kind of appalling that it goes this way. And they think that the problem is the politicians are all the ones focused on air power and dropping bombs from the air, and the Navy folks just want to fight battles like they always fought it, on the sea, right? With ships versus ships. And if you're going to take away our ability to be relevant, then what's the point of having a Navy in general, right? So there is a ton of like political action that develops, but I think in the end, largely what the armed forces get is the kind of branches of service that they want and that they envision, right? I think in the end, they really do call the shots.
We talk about the negative. I would argue, if I was in your class, as an example of where the political power of the presidency and the Congress, where it worked, was during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that the Kennedy brothers and their staff, we knew what, for example, we knew what some of the advice was from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how to, hey, let's take this out quickly while we can, and they paused. A lot of luck involved, but yet in turn, if other people were involved, maybe the result would have been very different. But I would argue it worked at that time.
Yeah, and I would argue that the immediate aftermath of the MacArthur firing is that where civilian control is maybe at its strongest and the most confident is during the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson, is reported to have kind of bullied many generals by saying, "Don't pull a MacArthur on me," right? The implication being that I'm the man in charge, and if you buck my policy, then you're going to be fired, right? And you'll be disgraced. And I think that was a thing that a great many generals in the aftermath of Vietnam sort of despised, right? That when that war was over, they felt that civilians had been too much in charge of strategy. They didn't have enough input. And that war was, of course, a very depressing one for generals, right? That they thought if they had more control, then it would have been a different outcome. And so this last historian here who I quoted, Cohn, right, he kind of made the case that the sort of post-Cold War era, the Bush-Clinton era, was an era where generals were starting to reassert their dominance again, I think is a direct reaction to civilians having too much control during the 1960s and 1970s, right? But yeah, one good example of civilian control is the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would agree. But I think it is because post-MacArthur, presidents feel a lot more confident, right? All right, well, thank you very much for having me.
All right, well, thank you to all of our presenters and to the MacArthur Memorial team that worked so hard to put this together today. Thank you to all of our audience today, both in person and virtually, for taking the time out of your weekend to come explore history with us. And of course, thank you to the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation for making this program possible. And now I'd like you to join me in welcoming Major General Joe Reness, Executive Director of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, for some closing thoughts and some news about later this summer. So, General Reness, your remarks will conclude the program.
I feel a little unprepared. Amanda put this task on me yesterday. But I think it's a good conclusion as we think. The first words I remember at the Academy were when I said, I, Joe Reness, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's the first thing you learn and you go through. And I think all three of the speakers talked through that, but I think it's something that we all need to remind ourselves of. Many, many, many thanks to Jim, Tim, and Mark for what I think is an outstanding presentation today, to be able to look at the same coin from all sides. And I think that that's really important for who we are and what we are. I think General MacArthur would think that also, because that's why he finally agreed to have the memorial here in Norfolk. And as Amanda already mentioned, it was because the mayor agreed that it will be open for everyone, it will be free, and most importantly, what he wrote down was it'll be a great place that we can talk about all the great things I did, ... and the not so great things I did. And I think that that's a reflection of the man, of who he was. Wasn't perfect, but he acknowledged that he gave his all and tried his best. One of the things, and I will not paraphrase it correctly, but Jim will remind me later, is MacArthur said that the only way we can truly learn about and correct mistakes in the future is to really learn history and talk about the history that we're involved with from all sides so that we can correct it and go forward in the future. Amanda asked that I come up with a couple thoughts about all of this for today. And from a military perspective, having served 35 years and both on the political side working for Secretary Cohen and on the military side working for General Franks, General Abizaid, and General Odierno at the combatant commander level, I would say communication, communication, communication. And the reason I say that is I watched the same kind of mistakes that we saw between President Truman and General MacArthur happening during those commands. And it's the ability of the commander, as General Abizaid would always tell me, it's the responsibility of the commander to make sure communication and authorities are understood. Get clear objectives, clear authorities, and read them back to your boss so your boss understands what you're doing. I think that would have solved a lot of problems in 1951. The other part of it is that we take away a lesson that all military members, and I know Glenn's here, and they talk about it at the Joint Forces Staff College. For me, it was the Armed Forces Staff College. Is intelligence is our best guess at the time we see it. It is not always right. In fact, more times than not, it is incorrect. But it gives us a direction and a perspective. And I think it's important to be able to understand that as you look back in history and look at different things. As Pete brought up, and I totally agree with him, the authorities for the Joint chiefs of staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the combatant theater commander were ill-defined in the 1950s. And until Goldwater Nichols, I don't think that they really were defined in such a way that people understood what their responsibilities and authorities were. And I will end that with then one last thing about civilian authority. And it kind of led with what I started with. I will support and defend. General MacArthur, I think in his mind, as I see it and look at it, was doing what he's morally bound to do as a combatant commander in a theater losing people. How he may have executed it may not have been perfect, but I think he was bound that way. And I think that that leads to the moral responsibility that we have as combatant commanders and responsible for people's lives to be able to give our best advice, but no one an order is given to follow it. And that's why I believe General MacArthur, once relieved of command, and I hear so many people say fired, when relieved of command, accepted it, moved, and never, except for the speech in Congress, probably said anything directly attributable or against. He talked about policies, authorities, and responsibilities. But more importantly, I think today was about a chance to talk about these things, to learn about these things, and now pass that on to others. And that's what the foundation tries to do in supporting the memorial. One of the best programs, and I know you don't have time to listen to it or really understand it, one of the best programs we have is through Jennifer back there who just came in, and that's the things we reach out to the schools. There's a Foot Locker that goes that talks about World War II, World War I, the Korean War, that reaches out to these young students and lets them know about the conflicts, let them know about the personal things that happened, and more importantly, revolves around duty, honor, country. And that's the takeaway I'd like to leave all of you with today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us, and look forward for future things that we're going to do, especially in August here, where we're going to have a leadership conference in conjunction with the Joint Forces Staff College, and then their celebration of their 80th anniversary. So wishing all of you a good day and look forward to seeing you around here. Take care.